Good morning and welcome to the ACLU of Oregon's 2020 Membership Conference, Justice for All. My name is Christina Nguyen. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the ACLU of Oregon's Membership Engagement Officer, and also your host today. Thank you for joining us. As fires rage statewide, we are thinking of those who have been displaced, impacted, and who have lost loved ones due to the wildfires. We hope that this conference offers a temporary and hopeful distraction as we come together as a community to strengthen our resolve and skills during these difficult times. This conference is recorded and will be available to our website early next week. Please feel free to revisit and share it with your networks. Today, many of us are located on the traditional village sites of Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kailapua, Molalla, and other Indigenous nations. We pay our respects to our elders, past and present, who have stewarded this land for generations. We encourage you at this conference to learn more about the land you're on by visiting the website in the chat box. I want to start off by thanking our captioners, Carol Studemond, Deanna Baker from LNS Captioning, and our ASL interpreters, Summer Nunn and Angela Ford-Glukert. If you prefer to have the ASL interpreter's window large and the rest of the participants' window much smaller, you can do so using the pin feature in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to make one window larger than the rest. We hope you'll ask questions during the panels, and to do so, you can type your question in the Q&A box and not the chat box. The Q&A box is located at the bottom of your screen and it has a letter Q on the box. If anybody needs ASL interpretation to ask a question, please let us know by sending us a message in the chat box. We are extremely excited about this year's membership conference, Justice for All. Much of our work is done in coalition, and today we're excited to feature many of the community partners and organizations we work with across Oregon. We have assembled a powerful and inspiring group of speakers and panelists who are leading the fight to dismantling systems of oppression, and we are deeply committed to honoring and respecting them in their work. As such, we start today's session with group agreements. By participating today, it's our expectation that you'll create a space that values and respects differences of race, ethnicity, immigration status, age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, ability, and socioeconomic circumstance. We'll respect and contribute to the ACLU's culture of belonging by fostering an equitable and inclusive experience in all aspects of community work by centering BIPOC voices and experiences. This will look like listening to understand, making space for and prioritizing oppressed voices, speaking my truth responsibly, taking responsibility for your actions and impact regardless of your intent, and for white people and other privileged identities to not put the burden on BIPOC and other oppressed groups to educate you about the harm that your actions and behavior created, and being willing to do things differently and experience discomfort, and seeing discomfort and tension as an opportunity to grow, not a barrier to it. Thank you for your willingness to be here and honoring this space. I have a few more logistical notes before we dive in. First, we know that internet connections can sometimes be spotty. If you happen to get disconnected, you can use the same link that you used to rejoin or also dial in via phone. At the conclusion of the conference, a survey about your experience will open automatically. We want to know how we did, what we can do better next time, and what issues you'd like to learn more about. Now let's get started. Our first speaker is someone who has been with the ACLU of Oregon for the last 34 years. She has played many roles and worn many hats, and for most of her career, she has been the glue behind the scenes lifting up our fight for justice. For the last 15 months, she has served as the interim executive director. Please join me in welcoming Jan Carson. Jan, you're on mute.
Thank you, Christina. Christina is really the glue. On behalf of our board and staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second membership conference. We are gathered virtually at a particularly perilous moment in our nation's history, as we are in a fight to save our democracy. The Trump administration is fomenting violence across our country, trying to stop Americans from voting, exploiting police violence against Black lives as his clarion call for more law and order echoes across the nation, and specifically in Portland. We are also fighting for a better America, an America that fully acknowledges its white supremacist history and fully repairs the harms of 400 years of oppression, an America where all of us are truly free. It is through this lens that at this conference, we are centering racial justice and some of the BIPOC people who are leading this movement locally. For white people here today, it is an important opportunity for us to listen and learn from our speakers and panelists and follow their leadership. And when necessary, to sit with our discomfort. The collective distress white people are feeling now in the midst of this pandemic and racial reckoning has been the reality that Black and Brown communities have experienced for generations. Ensuring justice for all means that we must come to terms with our collective white silence that has allowed the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and thousands of Black people by police. It is the same silence that has created the conditions for the dehumanizing shooting by police that paralyzed Jacob Blake in front of his children. This is why reforming police is not enough. Today, you will hear from Oregonians leading these efforts. We are now over 100 nights into the protest for racial justice. And I am very proud that the ACLU of Oregon has a team of dedicated legal observers who are out there nearly every single night. Night after night in Portland, our legal observers witness large crowds of people lawfully exercising their First Amendment right to demand an end to police brutality and to racist policing, being met with clouds of tear gas and other chemical weapons. We have seen people shot with munitions and beaten with batons. People have been snatched off the streets into unmarked vehicles with no explanation. These abusive tactics have been used by law enforcement to intimidate, control, and devalue the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities for far too long. And police violence is not restricted to Portland. We are seeing police violence in Ashland, Bend, Salem, Eugene, the Dalles, Springfield, Prineville, Medford. Sadly, it's everywhere because this is a systemic issue. These police tactics have no place in a free society and fly in the face of constitutional principles. Local leaders and the ACLU are challenging these abuses in the courts. Don't Shoot Portland, a Black women-led organization, filed the first lawsuit to stop Portland police from tear gassing protesters. And now months later, Portland Mayor Wheeler finally just announced his decision to ban Portland police from using tear gas. Separately, the ACLU has filed multiple lawsuits on behalf of protesters, legal observers, medics, and journalists to challenge abusive and violent police practices, as well as unlawful police surveillance. The aim of protest is to disrupt because oppressive systems don't change on their own. The ACLU will continue to defend the rights of people to peacefully assemble and protest against police brutality in Oregon and across the country. We are also working with immigrant justice leaders across Oregon, many of whom you will hear from today, to stop local and federal law enforcement from violating the rights of immigrants in our state. At the national level, the ACLU has called for the disbanding of the Department of Homeland Security, and President Trump's use of DHS as his personal militia must be stopped. The ACLU has filed another lawsuit against DHS on behalf of Isidro Andrade Tafoya, a Washington County worker and US citizen who was illegally detained by ICE agents outside the Washington County courthouse in 2017. Throughout the ACLU's 100-year history, we have done important work to create changes to policing, and it has not been enough. It is time to reimagine public safety. It is time to stop growing our police budgets and to reinvest resources to help BIPOC communities to thrive. Today, you will hear from local activists driving the effort to divest from policing and reinvest in Black communities. The ACLU will support these efforts too, and we will need you to stick with us in this work. This summer, our country lost a true American hero, Georgia Congressman John Lewis. Like so many Black activists before him, he believed in a better America, a more just and equitable America. That America is worth believing in, is worth fighting for. The ACLU is all in. I hope you are all in too. Thank you for your support and for joining us in this important conference.
Thank you, Jan, for your many years of leadership. As a reminder, if you're just joining us and you prefer to have the ASL interpreter's window large and the rest of the participants' windows much smaller, you can use the pin feature to keep one window smaller than the rest. Our next speaker is a social justice advocate and community organizer. As the ACLU's first Chief Equity Inclusion Officer, she provides vision, leadership, and direction for the ACLU's nationwide strategy to support equity, diversity, and inclusion across all aspects of the organization's work and efforts. Please join me in welcoming Amber Hikes to our conference.
Thank you so much, Christina. Good morning. Oregon would be on my mind today, whether I was with you or not. I know that in addition to COVID, in addition to anti-Black violence and white supremacy, in addition to a terrifying anti-constitutional police state, you are also facing unimaginable fires. I know that people you know and love, and maybe even some of you here with us, have been evacuated from your homes. Please know that everyone at ACLU National is watching closely and thinking of you all constantly. My name is Amber Hikes, and as you just heard from Christina, I am the first Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at ACLU National, where I provide the vision, leadership, and direction for the ACLU's nationwide strategy to support equity, diversity, and inclusion across all aspects of the organization. I have to tell you, to be honest, I never thought I'd be so happy to be on a Zoom call with a lot of lawyers and other folks. But here's what I do know. Our Constitution deserves at least as good of an attorney as the current occupant of the White House. So I'm so glad that y'all are doing what you're doing. And we are doing a whole lot better than just that. We are winning. The country's eyes are on Oregon, and I just couldn't be prouder. I hope you all also couldn't be prouder of what the ACLU is doing here for all of us in every state. And I just want you to know that we are all watching, hopeful and sometimes horrified, but we're always inspired and incited. And I know that I don't have to tell you that this year has been hard. We've spent this year, a year where we should have been able to simply focus on our health and the safety of our families and communities. A year where so many of us all of a sudden became full-time caretakers, homeschoolers, sourdough bread bakers, virtual wedding planners, and Plan B experts. A year where some of us had to say a last goodbye over FaceTime. We also spent that year in a more coordinated and expansive fight for racial justice than our country has seen in a generation. You spent that year at the ACLU and in Oregon in particular, defending and expanding our civil liberties. And with some of the most historic wins in racial justice, in immigrants' rights, and reproductive rights, and legal reform, LGBTQ protections, student and youth empowerment, there is a lot we have gotten right. And yet, we have not come this far to only come this far. We know that we cannot leave anyone behind in our fight for civil liberties. There's no waiting a turn for freedom. No, we'll come back for you next. No, we'll see if we can get to that next year. No, it is all of us, and it is all of us right now. This is the call. But the bad news is, it's not going to be easy. If 2020 has taught us anything, is that it ain't going to be easy. But you know what? The good news is, we on this Zoom call, we're not looking for what's easy. We're not looking for a leisurely ride to freedom, because we know that that means that we packed to light. It means we left too many of our siblings along the way. And what good is it to arrive at the top if all it affords you is a bird's eye view of everyone we left behind? I can tell that you all know that, and you have centered today around that understanding. I could see that when I looked at our powerful agenda. The calls for redistribution of funds and resources out of the police and carceral state and into Black communities are some of the most important calls of our time. I know there's some discomfort when people hear the phrase defund the police, but it doesn't feel so beyond the pale to me to consider that the police may not be the best answer to nearly every social problem that arises in our communities. We must invest in other solutions, like social workers and community-led efforts in education and healthcare and housing and basic programs that right now in so many of our communities are being funneled through the police. Experiencing homelessness? The police come. Living with addiction? The police. High school has a disturbance? The police. Navigating mental health, intimate partner violence, protests, police. Defunding the police is about taking the funding the police currently receive to be the front line of so many social issues and redistributing that money into communities and organizations that are better equipped to address and solve them. And I am so encouraged about today's panel on this very issue because we need all of our communities and all of you meaningfully and mightily engaged in this work. And then I looked further at our agenda and saw that we'll be focusing on the profoundly important and necessary work of organizing for immigrants' rights. Defending the civil rights of immigrants is some of the ACLU's most sacred work. This movement is our collective responsibility. Resourcing, uplifting, and centering immigrant organizers is critically important, and we must do it together and with a force that will not let up until all of us are free, all of us are safe, and all of us are home. Because at the ACLU, we believe we the people means all of us. I know some of you are familiar with that slogan. We've been workshopping it for a while now. We the people means all of us. You know, I love it, but there's a debate because we know that when those words were written, it didn't mean all of us. It didn't mean Black people or Indigenous people or women. Looking around today, it didn't mean a lot of people on this Zoom. When the country's framers wrote those words, they may not have meant all of us, but our work at ACLU has always been aspirational. Our work has always been about believing in something greater than what was first written, and believing in something bigger than whoever first wrote it. And that's the beauty of the ACLU of Oregon, because whether it's an unmarked van kidnapping a protester in Portland, or the illegal detention of Isidro Andrade Tafoya outside the Washington County Courthouse, when they say some of us, we say, well, we'll see you in court. Now, you all know I work at ACLU National, as Christina said, and I work about 2 doors down, well, when offices were a thing, 2 doors down from our National Executive Director, Anthony Romero. Now, Anthony started the ACLU just 2 weeks before September 11th, 19 years ago. And he talks often about how the organization has changed and grown and expanded and adjusted to meet the civil liberty needs and challenges of our time. And when he talks about this time in our country's history, he says, we are in the fight of our lives. And I agree with Anthony. But when I look at the work ahead for the ACLU of Oregon and all of our affiliates, when we're talking about people of color and Black and Indigenous and Latinx people specifically, when we're talking about women and immigrants and LGBTQ people, but especially our trans and non-binary siblings, when we're talking about people experiencing poverty, people that are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, disabled folks, our Muslim and Jewish communities, young people, elders, we are not just in the fight of our lives, we are in the fight for our lives. But y'all are well armed for this fight. The ACLU of Oregon in particular is 47,000 strong. You are bold thinkers and brave actors. You are accomplices and agitators. You are resistors and builders. You are who we've been waiting for. And I am so grateful that you are not alone. As long as we are striving for justice, for equality and liberty, we are part of an unshakable legacy. We, you and I, civil libertarians, we are the descendants of Roger Baldwin and Helen Keller. We are the wildest dreams of Mabel J. Byrd and Pauli Murray and a young Ruth Bader Ginsburg. We are the torchbearers of Roe v. Wade, Brown v. Board, Lawrence v. Texas. We are the promise of democracy, of justice, and liberty. Now, I've been talking too long. I do need to get out of the way so we could hear from the astoundingly brilliant Walidah Imarisha, a beacon of light and truth. Our humanity always reflected and challenged by her in a way that makes us all want to do a little bit better. But before I go, let me leave you knowing that no matter how long you've been here or what led you to us, this is your home. Home is the quiet, long nights of this work, and it is the bright spotlight of our victories. Home is in the communities we bring with us and the fullness of knowing we belong. Home is better than what we remember and bigger than who we are right now. Home is the feeling of resilience and the expansiveness of our own power. Thank you all for your transformative work that you are doing every day to make these cities, this state, and this country home. A home where we the people truly, finally, means all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber, for your inspiring and powerful words. At this time, we have a short break until 10 o'clock. If you want to stick around, we have a few inspiring videos to share with you about our work. We'll see you after the break at 10 o'clock.
The week that President was elected, we told him, we'll see you in court. We put out full-page ads in the New York Times and the Washington Post saying, if you implement the kinds of unconstitutional measures that you threatened during your campaign, we'll challenge them in court. And we did.
Looking back now, 3.5 years later, it's hard to imagine that that would become 400 legal actions against the Trump administration's anti-civil liberties agenda.
One of my memories from our battles during the Trump administration is from the Jane Doe case. After weeks of battling the Trump administration that tried to block Jane Doe from accessing abortion, pushing her further into her pregnancy, saying that she couldn't leave the shelter where she was staying, she finally made it to the clinic one morning. And when I got the phone call that she had made it to the clinic, I burst into tears.
My favorite moment litigating Gavin Grimm's case is actually one of the low points in the case. On February 22nd, 2017, the guidance that had supported Gavin was being withdrawn. And that same day, Gavin was out at a rally in front of the White House with his ACLU hoodie and with supporters and friends all around him, saying that this discriminatory action was not going to be the end of the matter. And no matter what happens,
no one, not even the government, can defeat a community so full of life, color, diversity, and most importantly, love.
When the SCOTUS decisions for Zarda and Stevens came out, I remember that what I felt wasn't quite joy. It was more just a sense of relief, you know? Because as someone who's trans, job security is something I think about all the time. Could I potentially, have my job placed in jeopardy for just being who I am, you know?
In late April of this year, during the height of the coronavirus pandemic, we filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of thousands of non-citizen military service members who are challenging a Trump administration policy denying them a path to expedited citizenship promised to them by Congress. The hearing was about a week out from my due date, and I had the unique experience of being able to argue before a court while seated on a giant exercise ball.
I remember as the first news of the executive order leaked out into the press, Trump was carrying out his campaign promise to institute a complete shutdown on Muslim immigration into the United States. And as we rushed to prepare our legal papers, something extraordinary happened. We saw people around the country rushing to airports, standing outside and raising their voices up against the President of the United States to say, you are not above the law and we, the people, will ultimately prevail.
The high point for me was when about a year into this, my wife was doing the crossword puzzle and she said, hey, look at this. The clue is group that told President Trump, "We'll see you in court." And I told her, I can help you with that answer. And when you are the answer to a clue in the New York Times crossword puzzle for your claim that you will be defending people's rights against the multiple threats that President Trump has visited upon the American public, you have to be proud.
I've never seen anything like the crisis we're living with right now. Folks struggling with substance use disorders are going to jail instead of getting into programs where they could be getting life-saving interventions.
We have tried the same thing for over 40 years, and it's just getting worse.
Mental health breakdowns, suicide, homelessness. It's affecting the whole community.
Patients who, because they can't get the treatment they need, they just end up in a revolving door through the court system.
We know that system is lopsided in terms of folks.
And it's just getting worse.
Mental health breakdowns, suicide, homelessness. It's affecting the whole community.
Patients who, because they can't get the treatment they need, they just end up in a revolving door through the court system.
We know that system is lopsided in terms of folks of color.
And when you criminalize someone, there's a huge negative stigma that's attached to that.
Just really hinders people's ability to get the help that they need.
If you have a criminal record, your options just close. It's about time, Oregon, to confront what's reality.
We are 50th in the nation for access to mental health and addiction services, and it doesn't have to stay that way.
There's definitely a shortage of beds all over the state.
Long waiting lists, and people have a difficult time finding appropriate treatment.
2 weeks to 3 months just to get an assessment appointment or an intake appointment.
We're leaving a tremendous amount of opportunity on the table when it comes to the people who are addicted to drugs.
How can we be so far behind the curve when it comes to providing treatment for people who need help?
Drug treatment in Oregon has been chronically underfunded for decades.
For me, being a provider, that's the biggest issue. You know, without the funding, you know, we're just talking.
This ballot measure would provide resources to fund treatment centers all over the state of Oregon.
Not just in communities that have larger issues, but for folks who may be traveling hours and hours in order to access treatment.
People should be able to wake up in the morning and say, this is not a way that I can live anymore, and they should be able to go find the services that they need that day.
More treatment centers will be open, more folks will get hired that look like me.
It's addressing health, it's addressing relationships, it's addressing employment and survivability.
It's extraordinary how the healing can take place if they're given the real opportunity to heal.
More peer support will get more people well again. It's just going to improve services for everyone in the state.
That major investment that it would put in place is really the key.
This is a step in the direction of putting people who are addicted to drugs first.
This is an issue that can unite us.
We need to be brave enough to try something new.
There is a better way.
Welcome back to the Justice for All conference. As a reminder, if you prefer to have the ASL interpreter's window large and the rest of the participants' window much smaller, you can use the pin feature to keep one window larger than the rest. And now it's time for the keynote address. Our keynote speaker is an educator, writer, public scholar, and spoken word artist. Perhaps she is best known locally for her 6 years as a public scholar with Oregon Humanities Conversation Project on topics such as Oregon Black history, alternatives to incarceration, and the history of hip hop. She has toured the country several times, performing, lecturing, and challenging. We look forward to her challenging us today. Please welcome our keynote speaker, Walidah Imarisha.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone for joining in the midst of so much happening. I appreciate the ACLU of Oregon inviting me to come and do this keynote. The framing for the conference is Justice for All. And I appreciate the use of the word justice. I find it to be much more useful than words like diversity or inclusion. I actually try not to even use those words because I think that they, especially in places like Portland, in these sort of liberal locations, those words are so overused that they mean very little. And they often focus and result in tokenism that allows the same systems of oppression to continue functioning. So that is why I prefer to focus on justice and beyond that, liberation. It's incredibly important to focus, as has been said before, on the folks who have been and continue to be systematically, systemically, and institutionally marginalized and oppressed. Specifically in this moment, Black folks and all BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC. It's incredibly important to recognize that access is not the issue, because in a system that is built on oppression, a system that is built on hierarchy, there will only be access for some of the oppressed. And access for some into the very same system that is breeding oppression actually can never be considered justice. To institute true justice, we have to understand that white supremacy is built into the foundations of Oregon, of this nation, of this world. And we have to begin to do the work to root it out. We also have to surface and continually center the leadership, the vision, and the long history of communities of color who are responsible for all advances in racial justice. And you cannot have justice without racial justice. If there's nothing else that you leave with today from my part of this, we cannot have justice without racial justice. Justice that only exists for certain groups is actually the foundation upon which systemic inequality exists. So without racial justice, it is just white supremacy. It's also incredibly important in this moment of inspiring and historic protests, marches, and organizing to recognize the absolute necessity for a diversity of tactics and strategies in our movements for change. When you look historically, every successful movement for change has utilized a diversity of tactics and strategies. And also, when you look historically, one of the main ways of disrupting movements for change and their progress by institutional power is to pit different groups against each other, furthering divides, exacerbating differences in ideologies or strategies. We cannot allow that to play out. We have to learn the lessons of history. And we cannot allow ourselves to be manipulated into furthering an institutional narrative that focuses on good protesters or bad protesters, that says, you know, we can either operate the way that the system tells us we can, or then we are criminalized and vilified and marginalized. We can't allow that to happen in our movements. I am incredibly inspired by the 100+ days of protests and organizing and mobilization that has been happening here in Portland, as well as across the country and around the world. It's incredibly important to recognize that direct action has been a fundamental, foundational part of all social change historically. It's also important to recognize, especially here in Oregon, that this current mobilization, this current moment and movement is intimately and inextricably tied to the legacy of resistance in the Black community. It is rooted in Oregon Black history and Oregon Black leadership. And I know that there will be a panel about that later, and I'm sure that there will be so much more important information that is shared during that. So during this presentation, I'm going to be sharing some key historical moments that focus on the Black community's experience here in Oregon around race, identity, and power. I'm going to be focusing on, again, the piece around institutional systemic oppression and centering the leadership historically of folks of color in general, specifically the Black community. So I will actually be sharing some information from my timeline, the Oregon Black History Timeline, which is a tool I created as part of my Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon, a hidden history program. I'll just be sharing a few historical instances. So I wanted to offer this to you as a resource. I put up now a few years ago, the Oregon Black History Timeline as a YouTube video. So if you Google Oregon Black History Timeline, or especially if you go directly to YouTube, this will be the first video that comes up, and you can learn much more about the historical context for what I'm sharing. As a historian, we always want to give people more information, and rather than go over my time doing that, I am presenting this for folks who want to learn more information about this. So if you just Google Oregon Black History Timeline, or go to YouTube and type in Oregon Black History Timeline, this will be the video that comes up. So just before I go into those historical pieces, I wanted to root in the understanding and some of the larger frameworks that I operate under. And one is that systemic and institutional white supremacy exist historically and today. That this information I'm presenting is not just a history, it is a living legacy. We cannot begin to understand the place that we live without this information. It is not an interesting fact from 100 years ago. It is the foundation of the place that we live, and we can't begin to understand it without this information. All of the institutions that shape our lives are rooted in the foundation of white supremacy here. White supremacy is alive, and we see that in every possible way, from street level white supremacist fascist violence to the brutal reactions of police over and over again nightly, to every indicator across the board. Racial disparities exist. And you can look up things like the Urban League of Portland's State of Black Oregon report to find out more information about that. We have to talk about race because this is literally life and death. The other framing that I think is incredibly important, and one of the reasons I think it is so important to study history, is because it shows us that this is the way that the system was intended to work. We often hear folks who are focused on reform saying the system is broken. When we look historically, nationwide, internationally, but especially here in Oregon, we see that the system is not broken. It is functioning exactly as it was intended to. And the last piece is that Oregon is not unique. While there are pieces of Oregon's history that stand out, the same policies, practices, and ideologies that shaped Oregon shaped every state in the union and shaped this nation as a whole. And so when we talk about the necessity of real institutional systemic change, when we talk about the need to dismantle oppressive systems and completely replace them, I'm not just talking about Oregon, but I'm talking about the nation as a whole. So I'm going to start and share some historical moments to highlight some of those pieces that I named. So it's incredibly important to recognize that the Oregon Territory, which included Washington, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, parts of Montana, was founded as a racist white utopia. So the entire Northwest was founded as a racist white utopia. The idea was that white people could come to the Northwest and build the sort of perfect white society that their ancestors had dreamed of when they came and colonized this nation. We see that in many of the policies and laws that were passed at that time. One of them is the Black Exclusion Law. So in 1844, the Black Exclusion Law was passed in the Oregon Territory, again, which means the entire Northwest. The entire Northwest, through the Black Exclusion Law, criminalized Blackness, said Black people were not allowed to reside in the Oregon Territory. And it also included the Lash Law that said that Black people would be publicly whipped up to 39 lashes until they left the state every 6 months. Left the territory every 6 months. That was just the first Black exclusion law. There were actually 3 Black exclusion laws that passed overwhelmingly, first in the Oregon Territory and in Oregon. We know that this is about building a racist white utopia for a couple reasons. One is that at the same time that the Oregon Territory outlawed Black people through the Black Exclusion Law, it outlawed slavery as well. And I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union a so-called free state. But the reality is that I would never call Oregon a free state, because the purpose of outlawing slavery was to stop folks from bringing enslaved Black people to the Oregon Territory. The other way that we know that this is about the creation of a racist white utopia is that the people who created it told us that explicitly. So Peter Burnett, who was a legislator at the time, who went on to become California governor, his name was actually attached to the Lash Law. It was called Peter Burnett's Lash Law. And in justifying the Lash Law, which again was about publicly torturing Black people over and over again until they left for the mere crime of existing, Peter Burnett said, "The object is to keep clear of that most troublesome class of population, Black people. We are in a new world under the most favorable circumstances, and we wish to avoid most of those evils that have so afflicted the United States and other countries. So they were very clear about the motivations for the founding of this place and for the ways that they built the institutions that shape, again, all of our lives. Another example of this is the 1850 Oregon Donation Land Act, which at the end of the day gave away 2.5 million acres of indigenous land in the Northwest for free, only to white settlers, literally to build this racist white utopia on. So this place is rooted in the theft of millions of acres of land of indigenous people and the exclusion, exploitation, and brutal containment of other communities of color in this area. This mentality resulted in Oregon being the only state in the Union admitted with a racial exclusion clause in its constitution. Oregon's constitution included the third Black exclusion law that banned Black people from living in Oregon, from making contracts, from holding real estate. There are many things that are incredibly important about the Black exclusion law in the Constitution. I think one of them that is most relevant to this conversation is that the language of Black exclusion was not removed from the Constitution until 2002. So until 2002, that language was part of Oregon's Constitution. And that was not because of an oversight by legislators, because the reality is the Black community came to Oregon, white Oregon, both through the ballot box and the legislature again and again for almost 80 years and said, remove this language and show us this is not the kind of place that you want to live. And again, white Oregon reinforced this is exactly the kind of place that we want to live. And for anyone who was here in 2001 into 2002, it was a fight to get that language removed. You remember this. There was immense pushback. It went to the ballot, and 30% of voters voted to leave the Black exclusion law in the Constitution. And many of their framing was about wanting to preserve Oregon's history, which many of us heard as wanting to preserve this history of a white supremacist utopia. So it's incredibly important to recognize again that this is the foundations of this place that we are living. And it is not, that's again why I like to call it a living legacy, because 2002 was yesterday. And the fact that even the symbolic removing of this language from the Constitution caused such backlash indicates to us where we are and how far we have and have not come. But the other piece that I wanted to highlight, and as I said at the beginning, is to show the ways that communities of color consistently, continuously have worked to institute and create racial justice, which is justice. It is incredibly important to center the agency and the determination of communities of color rather than centering the oppression that we are experiencing. Because when the oppression is centered, what often happens is that we frame BIPOC communities as passive victims rather than active change makers that they are. Again, all racial justice has happened because of the determination and the courage of communities of color. There is, as Dr. Karen Gibson talks about, a continuous thread of resistance that runs through Black communities here in this state. The minute that there was repression, there was resistance. And so even when the Black exclusion law was passed, there were over 100 Black people who heard this entire region say, "We will publicly torture you until you leave." And they said, "Well, we're not leaving. So what? What now?" That is an incredible act of resistance. It's important to recognize that Black communities were never supposed to exist here at all, and yet we always have. And again, that is because of the courage and the power of Black communities, who not only have existed and survived, but who have organized and changed again and again this city, this state, this region. And so I want to go through and look at examples of that organizing. I'm going to be talking about systems of oppression, but I'm going to be centering the resistance and the organizing of communities of color. And as a historian, this is what I try to do, is to root, again, not just in the oppression of communities of color, but in the organizing and the vision and the immense leadership of communities of color. So I'm not going to go into detail for all of these examples because we have limited time, but I wanted to show you that there is a long and immense legacy of communities of color organizing in this state, specifically the Black community organizing in this state, and across numerous issues. And so this example shows that in 1867, Black communities in both Salem and Portland organized to get education access for their children, as well as education access for other folks of color as well. And so specifically in Salem, the Black community raised $427.50 and started their own school, which was incredible at a time, again, when Black existence was criminalized. Folks were not only courageous enough to push back, they reimagined and started their own community-based institution. I definitely wanted to highlight and talk about the history of white supremacist fascism. And to be clear that issues of white supremacist fascism are not new. This has always existed, I mean, in this nation, but specifically in the Northwest and in Oregon. And how could it not, when the founding ideology is one that fits perfectly in with these organizations? Also, the collusion between white supremacist fascists and institutional power is not new. This is something that has existed from the beginning. We often try and historically frame groups like the Ku Klux Klan as separate from institutional white supremacy. The reality is that they work together in tandem and that they rely on one another. So we can see things like this picture, which ran in a local newspaper, that shows the Portland police chief, district attorney, US attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor posing with hooded Klansmen under a headline that says they are taking leadership from the Klan about what they want to see happen in this city. The next year in Oregon, the Klan helped to elect Walter Pierce. And so the highest member in Oregon's government was connected deeply and intimately with the Klan. But again, even in the face of that, Black communities were organizing and mobilizing. And so just one example of that, and there are many, is the Portland NAACP, as part of a national campaign, protested the virulently racist pro-Ku Klux Klan film, Birth of a Nation, that everywhere it screened nationally, white mobs would go out and attack Black communities afterwards. The NAACP and other Black organizations in Portland successfully organized to the point where the City Council of Portland banned the film from being screened here. And again, this is 1916. I often think about and try to imagine how much courage it would take to organize against the Klan in that time, in that climate. And I root in that history because that, again, is part of that continual thread of resistance that exists in the Black community here. I wanted to share this slide about the jazz culture in North Portland, which was world renowned. North Portland was known as a jazz treasure because it's important to recognize resistance takes many different forms. And again, in that understanding of a diversity of tactics and strategy, and in the understanding that our organizing and our mobilizing is holistic, I wanted to make sure that we were including cultural resistance as well as political resistance and policy changes. Because if we only focus on policy, on laws, we actually are not encompassing the entirety of how the system maintains itself. I wanted to share a little bit about Vanport, which was actually the second largest city in Oregon. And it was built to house the World War II workers who came to work in the Kaiser shipyards. It was 40% Black at its height. And it was completely destroyed in 1948 because it was not properly protected. So a dam broke, when the dam broke, and it was completely flooded out. Portland never wanted Vanport. It never wanted the Black workers who were there. The Housing Authority of Portland, which ran Vanport, actually made plans to demolish the city even before the end of World War II, because they wanted to make sure that Black people knew they were not welcome to stay here after the exploitation of their labor was no longer needed. So for me, one of the important pieces about Vanport is that they were also organizing in Vanport. And there was the Vanport Tenants League, which was an organization that was founded. The two main issues that they were exploring in the 1940s were affordable quality housing and police brutality. And I just want to raise that up to be clear that, again, this struggle against gentrification that is happening, the struggle against police violence and the larger ways that the system of policing is rooted in white supremacy is not new. It's not new nationally, and it is not new here in Oregon. That folks, Black folks specifically, have been organizing against this consistently for decades, for centuries, you could argue. So I just wanted to share the example of the Portland Black Panther Party chapter. There were actually two chapters of the Black Panther Party in Oregon, one in Eugene and one in Portland. This is a picture from the Free Breakfast for Children program, which ran for years and fed up to 125 kids every day, 5 days a week. It's incredibly important to recognize, because a lot of the times, I think the idea of white liberalism is that if communities of color gain control over resources and build community-based institutions, that they will create the same sort of exclusionary hierarchical institutions that white supremacy creates. But it's important to see that when the leadership and vision of communities of color is centered, the institutions that are created actually make the entire community safer and more whole. And so the Black Panther Party also had two healthcare clinics in Portland. One was a general healthcare clinic and one was a dental clinic. That dental clinic is still open today and is run through OHSU, Oregon Health Sciences University. So because of the Black Panther Party, that neighborhood has had, under the Panthers, free dental care, and under OHSU, low-income dental care for almost 50 years. So again, when institutions are created by Black communities and BIPOC communities, when they are rooted in the vision of liberation that those communities hold, they create institutions that actually make our entire communities safer and more whole. I'm not going to go into detail about the history of gentrification, of displacement, and of urban renewal, because honestly, we could be speaking about that for the entire length of this conference. I do encourage everyone to read Dr. Karen Gibson's essay, Bleeding Albina, and you can download that as a PDF online, Bleeding Albina. It details in immense and brilliant, information, historical framing, the ways that the current wave of gentrification is actually rooted in centuries of, or not centuries, apologies, in decades of private and public interests working together. So one of the earlier waves of displacement that existed for the Black community was the Emmanuel Hospital expansion, who worked with the city of Portland to destroy over 1,000 housing units in the Black community in Upper Albina. But I wanted to share this with you because, again, folks were organizing against that through things like the Emmanuel Displaced Persons Association and other organizations, using a multiplicity and diversity of tactics. And so, again, this work against displacement, the work against gentrification is not new. And folks have been not only mobilizing, but making plans, putting together strategies, putting together long-term policy recommendations that are still very much relevant today. And I encourage folks, again, to read things like the Urban League of Portland's State of Black Oregon report, the Portland African American Leadership Forum's Portland People's Plan, to see the ways that this framing has continued. So I also just, again, wanted to highlight that the organizing against policed violence is not new as well. And the connection between economic devastation and is not new, and the targeting and brutalization of Black communities by law enforcement. And so specifically, looking at, again, the intersections of police violence and white supremacist fascism, we can see parallels in the 1980s with things like the 1985 murder of Tony Lloyd Stevenson by Portland police in 1985. Tony Lloyd Stevenson was actually a good Samaritan trying to stop a robbery in progress. The police came, and even though the clerk said, no, that's not him, he tried to stop the robbery, they put him in a chokehold until he died, and they did not administer CPR. On the day of his funeral, police officers wore t-shirts with 2 smoking guns that said, "Don't choke 'em, smoke 'em." There was immense outcry from the Black community and mobilization like we see in this picture here. A few years later, white supremacists murdered Mulugeta Sarah in 1988, and who was an Ethiopian student and father, and they beat him to death on the street. The Black community, again, mobilized and organized against that. So again, dealing with the twin threats of institutional violence and street level white supremacist violence are not new for the Black community in Portland, in Oregon. Lastly, to just kind of bring it full circle, I wanted to end with the 1994 passage of Measure 11, which I know is something incredibly important for the criminal legal system, for groups like the ACLU of Oregon. For me, it is very much a sort of full circle moment. This mandatory sentencing program that was largely responsible for the explosion in Oregon's prison population and for the disproportionate impact on Black communities. it very much connects back to the criminalization of Blackness that is the foundations of this place, that it disproportionately affected Black people because rooted into the soil of this place is the notion of Blackness as criminal, as criminalized identity. And so again, we have to deal with the foundations here, because if not, whatever else is grown in that soil will have that embedded into its DNA. So, just to pull this all together, I think it's incredibly important to recognize we don't have time for piecemeal reform or surface reform. We need real systemic institutional change led by BIPOC communities, leadership and vision that is rooted in a historical understanding. Again, I cannot stress enough, these systems are not broken. They are operating exactly as they were intended to. And so they cannot be reformed. They must be reimagined, fundamentally changed, dismantled, replaced by things that actually reflect true concepts of justice and liberation. And just locally in Portland, I would strongly encourage folks to look into PALF, the Portland African American Leadership Forum, and Unite Oregon and other Black organizations' Divest, Reinvest, Protect campaign. It's rooted in this framework that understands that these systems cannot be reformed and that they must be abolished. They also very much recognize that when we talk about abolishing systemic oppression or institutions, it is a two-part process. It is about entirely dismantling those existing institutions while at the same time building community-based institutions that actually focus on the leadership and that vision rooted in BIPOC communities. So it's just important to recognize that when folks talk about abolition, they aren't just saying, it's not the same, right? I've heard a lot of people make the analogy, oh, you defund the police like we've defunded the schools. Absolutely not. Please don't do that. The reality that folks are talking about around abolition is about saying these resources need to be shifted into community-based control. That again, when we see that the leadership and vision of communities of color are centered, when the leadership of BIPOC folks is centered, they create institutions that institute racial justice and real justice. The last thing I want to say is that the other lesson that is incredibly important for me as a historian is to recognize that when you take the long view, the historical view, things become very simple. I think in the moment, people are told things are very complicated. There are many different sides to be looked at. I think that this is absolutely and especially true when dealing with the criminal legal system for folks like lawyers who are dealing with the nuances of these systems. I think it's important to continually pull back and take a larger, longer historical view. That when you do that, you see that there are two sides of history. There's a right side of history and a wrong side of history. And it is important to recognize that historically, folks thought that things were complicated that we now see as actually very simple. And you can see this when you look at pro-slavery arguments, or even people arguing that slavery can be reformed, that there can be changes made to make it a kinder, gentler slavery, or anti-civil rights movement people who were arguing that this progress, even if necessary, needs to happen at a much, much slower incremental pace. All of those folks ended up on the wrong side of history. I have no doubt that in 50 or 100 years, folks are going to look back on this time and say, how could they have let that happen? And how could they have let it happen for so long? There will be a right side and a wrong side of history. I am working very hard to be on the right side of history. And I hope that everyone else here will work very hard to be on the right side of history by taking concrete, lifelong, continuous action, again, that roots in abolishing unfair systems and centering those resources around those folks who have been most marginalized and oppressed. Again, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Walidah, for grounding us in that critical history, which is so important for us to root ourselves in as we work towards justice for all. We're grateful to have you at our conference. Thank you again. And at this time, we're going to take a short break before we dive into the panel. So we have a video for you to share before we get to our Divesting from Police and Reinvesting in Black Communities panel. We want you to be aware that the video might contain footage of police violence. Please do what you need to do in order to take care of yourself during this time.
Here we are again. People have taken to the streets to show their pain, show their outrage, and demand justice. At the ACLU, we've been doing it for 100 years, trying to protect that right to protest, that right to call people in power to account. And, you know, as you come out to
Welcome back, everyone. Please accept our apologies for the tech issues and viewing the ASL interpreter screen. We're 6 months into virtual gatherings and there's still lots to learn about Zoom. That said, hopefully this might help. You may need to choose the gallery view in the upper right-hand corner of the screen to see the interpreters. If you are on your phone, you can also try to get the gallery view by swiping across your screen. And again, to pin the speaker, click the 3 dots in the right corner of your video and pin video. But let's get to the panels. We hope you will ask questions during the panels, and to do so, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box. And if anybody needs ASL interpretation to ask a question, let us know by messaging us in the chat box. Now, our first panel is Divesting from Police and Reinvesting in Black Communities. It is my pleasure to introduce Lamar Wise, a political organizer, activist, and leader in the Reimagine Oregon project and an ACLU of Oregon board member. Lamar is also a board member of Safety and Justice Oregon, which advocates for criminal justice reform across the state. Lamar will be the facilitator for our first panel. We welcome Lamar, Paige, and Mac.
Good morning, and thank you, Christina. As Christina mentioned, our panel is Divest from Police and Other Institutions and Reinvest in Black Communities. While the nation really began to have this conversation since the murder of George Floyd, this is not a new idea, particularly amongst the Black community. While the nation really began to have, we also have been over-policed, overcharged, over-sentenced, and incarcerated for generations. It is long past time we reimagine safety in our communities. It is time that we invest in our social services, like our schools, our communities that have been severely under-resourced for generations. It's time for Black people to feel safe in Oregon. Black leaders across Oregon have asked us to reimagine. We have put together dozens of specific policy proposals from policing, housing, education, healthcare, and economic development, transportation, community safety, and I want to encourage all ACLU members to visit reimagineoregon.org to view some of these critical proposals that have been submitted by Black leaders across the state. Today, we're actually going to be focusing on a piece of reimagining community safety. We have a great panel that brings national expertise and local expertise. First, a little about the format today. We will start with brief introductions of our panelists who will share their ideas for police accountability and move to divest and highlight some of the work that they're doing to divest from policing and reinvest in Black communities. Then we have time for questions. If you have a question for our panelists, please post it in the Q&A and we will do our best to get to it. Our panelists, actually our first panelist is Paige Fernandez, who is the Policing Policy Advisor for the National ACLU. Paige develops and implements comprehensive strategies that advances ACLU's affirmative vision for reducing the role, power, presence, and responsibilities of the police in the US. She also develops and leads nationwide advocacy around police practices. Paige has approaches the work of policing advocacy through community engagement and is at the forefront of the work and has practiced grassroots organizing throughout her life. Prior to joining the ACLU, she co-founded and directed multiple chapters of Together We Stand, a nonprofit aimed at dismantling racism, discrimination, and police brutality. Please welcome Paige.
Thanks so much, Lamar. I'm really excited to dive into a conversation with everybody who's attending today. So I'm going to try to keep opening remarks short, but I'd like to just kind of frame the problem that we're encountering in the United States around policing right now, talk a little bit around the definitions of divest and reinvest, and then, pass it off to Mac. But thank you so much, Lamar. So across the country, every day, Black and Brown people experience the police as an intrusive, oppressive presence, one that not only fails to protect them from being harmed by other members in the community, but one that routinely inflicts its own harms, from humiliation to broken bones to death. And the scale and power of policing institutions in the US are immense. There are over 18,000 police departments in the country, and they have a collective budget every year of over $115 billion, which excludes federal grants and resources that are millions and millions of dollars worth. Combined, our law enforcement agencies in the United States make 10.3 million arrests per year. However, only 5% of those 10.3 million arrests are for what we'd consider the most serious offenses. So things like rape and aggravated assault and murder. The other 95% of arrests that police spend their time making are for incredibly petty offenses like crimes of poverty, marijuana possession, things that really don't need to be criminalized in the first place and definitely don't need to be handled by the police. This just all points to the gigantic, outsized role that empowers police to act as an occupying force in low-income communities and communities of color across the country. And the problem here, the underlying reasons for why police are an oppressive institution, isn't a lack of training and procedures. Just to take one example, the Minneapolis police officers who murdered George Floyd this summer were already governed by policies that prohibited the officers from pressing knees into necks, policies that directed officers to intervene in any dangerous policy violations, and training that reinforced these policies. Still, George Floyd was murdered. So none of this stopped the officers from murdering George Floyd. So when we think about the problem with policing, it really stems from the combination of legal statutes and case law that incentivize over-policing and shield police departments and their officers from legal consequences, the overinvestment in policing and its related and punitive programs like jails and prisons, and underinvestment in alternative and preventative services that have fueled our mass incarceration crisis in this country. And so that's why I'm really excited to be talking about divestment today, because we're really at a turning point in this country, and we need to be talking about transformational change in policing. And it's important that we talk about divestment because that is the most transformational change we can implement right now. And just to frame this a little bit, and then I'll wrap up, people often ask me, what are we talking about when we say divestment? And at least from ACLU National, I can say divestment and reinvestment refers to a shift of power, funding, resources, and responsibility away from the punitive and harmful institution of policing and into life-affirming, community-based, and community-led supportive services. Divesting from police means dramatically reducing the role of police in the United States and reallocating savings to alternatives to police and to communities that have historically been targeted by police, specifically Black, Indigenous, and low-income communities. I'm really looking forward to talking about this with you all now, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Awesome, thanks, Paige, and thank you so much for your work. It's super important, and I'm glad that the ACLU National is taking on a lot of that role in the community. So our next panelist is Mac Smith, a tech analyst, journalist, concert producer, social justice advocate, husband, father of four, and as a steward of a local hip hop scene, he spent years protesting police brutality and the overreach towards Black and Brown communities. This summer, he's focused on tangible goals of defunding the Portland police. Please welcome Mac to the panel.
Hey, what's up, guys? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I'm Mac Smith. Really, I'm blessed to be here. I really stand on the backs of a lot of the people that have already spoken today. Walidah has been amazing. Everything that Paige I just said, I totally agree with. For me, I think that the perspective
Mac, Hey, Mac, could you speak a little bit louder?
Yeah, yeah. For me, I think that the perspective that I bring is probably that I exist in the protest. I do a lot of journalism around the protest. And for me, it seems pretty clear that the history of policing here and the current existence of policing here is extremely overblown. It's extremely it's overfunded. And in reality, the police here are not doing the service that they are supposed to be doing. I focus on Portland. I know this is a national issue and has been for a long time, but I really focus on Portland. And I feel like the abolition of police here is really a possible thing. And I think that defunding of the police is the mechanism through which to do that, politically and logically. You can't just go and chop a tree down and expect to still eat. You still have to have fruit. So you have to make those steps to, go in that direction. I think the thing that I believe in is truly making sure that we're taking those steps to go in that direction. And also, it seems that whenever the people are given a promise that we are going in that direction, we all chill out and go back to normal, and then things don't go in the direction promised. So I think that a lot of the focus of the protest and whatnot is really to keep the attention on this and get this going as far as humanly possible. So I also don't want to take a whole lot of time up in introductions. And again, I appreciate the words of everyone that spoke earlier, and I'm looking forward to speaking more about this.
Awesome. Thank you both. And thank you, Mac, for all you've done, just being on the ground and continuing to prioritize the Black community in your work. So with that being said, we're actually moving to the section where we're going to be doing questions. And so I had a couple of questions, but I also know that, again, if the audience has questions, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them. But to just open us up, the first question I have for you all is, what are some structural changes that you want to see within the next year to law enforcement and policing? Like, what do you think that we should prioritize in terms of structural change that we should see? And I'll start with Paige.
Yeah, I mean, what I really hope we'll see over the next year is some actual political will put behind divestment and defunding the police, right? Every year on the municipal level, there is a budget session where our municipal leadership, so usually mayors and city council members, depending on the makeup of your municipal leadership, will determine our city's budgets. And these budgets often allocate a ton of money to policing. The Vera project, the Vera Institute just recently released a tool where you can see the exact budgets and how much policing takes up of your city's budget in states across the country. And so what I'm really hoping we see is meaningful divestment. I think we saw a lot of lip service this summer from politicians who were trying to appease people who were in the streets demanding justice and transformational change, right? And so they paid a lot of lip service. They said, we're going to do this, but didn't really act on it. And when you think about the absurd amount of money police get every year, $115 billion, and all the things we underinvested that we have divested from. So housing, education, mental health services. There's so many ways we can reinvest the funding that goes into police. And I want to just make this final point that I think it's really important when we talk about divestment, people get a little bit concerned. What will we do about crime, especially when it comes to violent crime? And I think it's really important to say two things. The first is that, crime is not random. Crime, in quotes, occurs when someone can't meet their basic needs through any other means, which is why it is so important for us to take policing money and to reinvest it in community-based services so as to allow people to meet their basic needs and provide them with the opportunities to thrive. The second point is that crime is truly a social construct, right? Current law creates a mass criminalization of poverty, drug use, trans status, disability status, and immigration status. And many of these forms of criminalization effectively make it illegal to live while Black, while trans, and while poor. So really many of these laws shouldn't exist in the first place. So that leads me to the point that there is a ballot measure in Oregon this year to decriminalize drugs across the board, which would be huge because it would significantly reduce the role of police and affirmatively says that, we shouldn't be using police when it comes to substance use. That is not the role that they should play. So really, I'd hope to see significant divestment in the next year, and also these bold measures like the ones being taken in Oregon to really reduce the responsibilities in the role of police.
Then Mac, if you would like to answer that question, like what's one structural change?
I hate following Paige.
Yeah, it's okay. We'll
not fair.
We'll make sure you go first. Next
we got to switch it up next time.
I got
That's
you.
Not fair. No, but totally. The thing that I would like to see initially, because I believe that we can take a significant chunk of the police, resources immediately. I think that can happen right off top. I don't think it has to be like $10, $15 million at a time. I think we could take $50 million chunks and really reallocate that. As Paige said, crime does not just exist in the abstract. People don't just wake up and say, I'm going to crime today. They have to have a reason to be out there putting themselves and others at risk. And really the thing I think about is that people don't want to destroy a society that they're a part of. People never want to tear up their own team. What we are really seeing here is people who feel like they're not a part of the team. People who feel like they have not been included. People who feel like these systems that are for welfare and whatever are designed to trap them and not to help them, and who see no other way to a better life than through crime, or even in some cases for a survival, except than a petty crime. When we do things like criminalize shoplifting and things like that of people who are hungry, you are putting a target on this person's back for the next 5, 10, 15, possibly their whole life. You're making it hard for this person to get a job. You're making it hard for this person to get a job that is actually fruitful. I mean, they can go and work in a kitchen. That's all they're going to be able to do. They can never become the manager. They can never get a driver's license. All these things start to add up, and these people just become oppressed. And so what you're seeing now, I think, is that we are seeing a society that has funded police so much because the only answer that we've offered for crime is policing. And so now we've just thrown all this money, millions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars at the police, who can't actually do anything to stop it. All they can do is catch it on the receiving end. At some point, you've got to sack the quarterback. So we have to take this money and give it back to our communities. We have to fund our social programs, our boxing gyms, the things that give the kids something to do. We have to, fund homeschooling programs for kids that don't do well in school, instead of just forcing them into a prison pipeline. There's so many things that we can do, and there's so many programs and people on the ground. Randall Wyatt, the Taking Ownership program that he started this year, is an example I've touted for months, where he has been collecting money through a nonprofit and helping older, especially Black families, stay in their homes through renovations. It's just, you can't stop gentrification by opening up apartments back in the old neighborhood, but you can stop gentrification by allowing people to keep their homes. And it's the same with crime. It works the same way. We can't arrest everybody doing wrong, because soon we'll have more people in the jail than we do on the streets. And what does that mean? That's really like at slavery. That's where we started. And we're trying not to creep back in that direction. I think that the US already has more people incarcerated than any other country has ever had in the history of the world. And it's not even close. We have, as much as we talk about China being authoritarian, we have like 4 million more people in prison than China. And they have 5 times our population. So this is something that we have to think about as a society. How are we going to get people help as opposed to making them criminals? Because as Paige said, it's really just a social construct.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, the policing is just one part of what incarcerates our folks, right? And Mac, to your point, like we know that what the Black population in Oregon is about 2%, a little over 2%, but meanwhile the Black population in Oregon's prisons is closer to like 10%. It's clearly an issue, and if folks don't see that, like we need to continue to tell the story of this is a problem, and it is a structural one, right? Which is one of the reasons why we started with that question, is because structural racism is real, and we need to call it out. Like we need to call out the anti-Blackness that is literally embedded within the concrete walls of the institutions that lock up our people. With that being said, it looks like we got a question from PFlag that I wanted to make sure that we restate what divestment means, because we were going a little bit too fast. And so if you all want to just like take one moment, a sentence or two, what does divestment mean to you? Let's start with Mac.
Thank goodness, I'm on the follow page again. For me, divestment is a cool term. I like it. I like the fun, but divest is cool too. It just means that we're going to take money away from one thing to move it somewhere else. And it's not to not have the same end. We still want the same end of public safety, but to do it in ways that actually keeps everyone safe. So instead of criminalizing and causing issues for people by just calling the cops whenever there's problems, and instead of creating risks and high attention armed situations by calling up police in situations where their guns really aren't helpful, I think it becomes a much more prudent and efficient process to send out people that are equipped to handle the situations at hand. And that's really just if we're talking about emergency response. In reality, a lot of the police's detective work and sitting in donut shops and stuff could really be moved to people doing actual work on the ground to prevent crime as opposed to try and chasing crime. And I think that's the biggest shift that I talk about in a divestment or the funding, is to move money from emergency response to emergency preparation. And that's really the key, or really to emergency, not even a preparation, but emergency prevention. That's really the word I'm looking for, because you don't always have to chase the ambulance. Sometimes you can get ahead and do the work ahead of time. And I think it's really possible, and I think it's not a radical idea.
Yeah. Why not put more investments on the front end, right? In terms of services and ensuring that folks don't even have to seek out a service such as the police, right? Like having someone come to your door with a gun when really you're just trying to settle maybe like a dispute or what have you, right? Like there's a variety of options. And we actually got another question related to this, and Paige, I would like you to answer this, and it's related, which is, we got a question from Jenny. Does it matter if we say divest or defund? And also, does it matter if we strategize with police departments or not? And this question is coming about because there's a perception by some white people that this approach and language is too hostile and will never work. And just Paige, before you answer this, I just need to take a quick whack at it, just because we haven't even started to talk about abolition in this conversation yet, right? If we want to talk about something that's hostile, like that whole idea, I think is like something that jars people. But I do want to have this conversation about language, right? Because we've heard abolition, we've heard reimagine, we've heard divest and defund and divestment. So like Paige, like what's the deal? Like what do you think we should be using? Like what are the words?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad this question got brought up. and I really want Matt to chime in after, because I think, you know, I will talk about it from kind of like ACLU National's perspective, but I think what's important here is that like what the definitions that matter are the local advocates definitions, because that's where the work is happening. That's where the work is going to get done. That's where like the transformational movement work happens. And so the language that's happening, like that local advocates use, I just think like as a preface, like you should just be using that language and respecting local Black organizers and leaders on the ground and the language that they prefer. ACLU National has decided to say divestment based on conversations we've had with some of our partners from Law for Black Lives and Movement for Black Lives, so other Black-led nationwide organizations. And is there a difference between defunding and divestment? Yes and no. Fun answer. In principle, both defunding and divestment are the same, but the phrase defund the police, at least on the national level, was created by Black-led organizations and Black organizers that treat defunding as a step along the way to the complete abolition of police. And so for the ACLU National's offices, to use the phrase defund the police without also taking a very firm abolitionist stance is just watering down the abolitionist work. And we don't want to do that, right? We want to support and uplift Black leadership. We don't want to water down their demands. And so while we're not at abolition right now, we can support divestment and put resources behind, you know, as Max said, like this is a tactic, right, to get to somewhere different. And so we prefer to use divestment because we really do not want to undermine the work being done by abolitionists. I just, on the hostile point, I just had to laugh. It like tickled my soul because there was this great video of Jane Fonda going around on Twitter yesterday on The View. And one of the interviewers on The View asked her, you know, defund is so aggressive. It's so aggressive. And Jane Fonda was like, we are just two white women. We don't get to say that. We are following the lead of Black leaders and Black organizers. So too bad if we think it's too aggressive. So that's kind of my answer to that. If it's too hostile, too bad you're not suffering the brunt of police brutality and police oppression.
Say that. Say that. Mac, what about you? How do you feel about the language that we use and yeah, where are you at and what do you say?
You know, as a writer, words, words, you know, defunding is what I usually say. That's what I'm trying to do. I mean, as a strategy that I look towards at what I think needs to happen, I think we need to take the money from the police that will force them to reform. I think we keep on taking money from police as a strategy and as a process, and over time that leads to abolition. So defunding the police works perfectly fine for me. I actually like the word divest just on a personal level. I think it's a really cool word, divest. It's just written well. So I like it. I think that it's, for some reason, the people feel like it's friendlier than defund. Like it means the exact same thing. Take the money and put it somewhere else. So it actually is a more complete term for what I want to see outright, which is divesting. It actually is a more immediate request to take money away and invest it simultaneously. I think that's really a great term in that regard. I try not to get too caught up in the words. If we're saying divest, defund, abolish, the words I don't love are oversight and reform. So I think that those, at least locally, have become catchwords that turn people off in the protest, at least. Not everyone. There are definitely the folks out there that love, terms like reform. And that's fine and appreciated. You're on our side. You're just not as far over as we are. So, cool. But yeah, real quick, it is hilarious that defund is aggressive because I mean, as a Black man, I've been called aggressive, like in the elevator, and stuff like that. So right? it kind of harkens back to defund the police. Oh no, like, that doesn't even mean anything harsh or hostile. So that's kind of comedic.
Yeah, and just in this conversation of words and what we say, right? Like, people forget, like, for example, ICE has not been around for that long, yet the undocumented community has called for abolition of ICE. I think, I want to say less than 10 years ago, something around there that ICE was created. We could go back to a system that supports our communities and changes things for the better. And so I just want to put that out there that yeah, like we shouldn't be afraid to engage in the different language. I identify as an abolitionist, but I say reimagine safety because I think that captures a lot of folks, and really I think it captures what we are trying to do, which is to rethink our system. Like literally, like if we were to build it again from the ground up. And part of that strategy is defunding, right? It is divesting. And so, you know, there's a variety of different models. And this is actually related to a question that we have, because not only do we have to think about where the money goes, but also where the power is. And so a question from Jim is, how important are police unions as an impediment to divesting police, right? Let's talk about police unions for just a little bit, because I feel like we have had some experience, right? Let's go to Paige first. Let's see what Paige thinks.
I love when people bring up police unions. I am just so glad that people are like publicly talking about police unions as a huge impediment to the work that advocates and activists who are working on transforming policing, on abolishing police, like are doing, because I mean, it's seriously, they are the worst. They are a huge problem. And I think there are two discrete ways that I want to frame the problems that they pose. They have both internal and external powers. So both internally, they have a lot of control over how police departments function, how police officers are held accountable or not held accountable, how transparent police departments are. And that's through kind of their police union contracts and the CBAs that they negotiate with cities. And these contracts, you know, have really horrific and egregious provisions like officers have a cooling off period after killing someone where they can't be interrogated for 48 hours, and they get access to body cam footage of the incident and access to interviews with witnesses and access to other officers' statements, all before being interrogated. That's in contracts, right? There are other contract provisions that say you need to completely erase officers' records after 60 days. Like, it is absolutely wild. But when talking specifically around divestment, there are a lot of provisions that require cities to pay legal fees and to pay for misconduct settlements. So between 2003 and 2015 in Minneapolis alone, the city paid out $25 million in police misconduct settlements. So that means that our tax dollars are being paid out in police misconduct settlements because they hurt us, the taxpayers. They hurt the community members, which is just absolutely mind-boggling. And so that's a huge problem. When we talk about divestment, like the $115 billion figure totally doesn't include misconduct settlements or legal fees. And we know just how much misconduct occurs in police departments, right? So there's millions and hundreds of millions of dollars spent every year on that, which is a huge impediment to divestment. How do we divest from the police if the city spending so much money protecting them? And then the other thing I just want to raise briefly, sorry, I could talk about this all day, I get really heated, is kind of the external powers that police unions have that pose another problem to divestment because they have so much power over local politicians and state politicians because they donate so heavily to political campaigns, which then makes politicians beholden to them. And they donate across the political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, independents alike, right? So they have an enormous amount of influence and lobbying power over them as a result of their political contributions.
Mm-hmm. Mac, what do you think about this?
You know, I think with the police unions, if we go back to like early June in the big marches, I remember telling everybody, hey guys, you're not going to defund the police if you don't get rid of the union first. This union contract is up at the end of June. We have to do something. No one's talking about it. It's like, you know, in June, the unions were like the boogeyman. No one wanted to talk about it. They weren't sure how it was important. And now here we are looking at changes. And, you know, I talked to Ted Wheeler about this just recently. We talked about this and how 4 years ago, we were looking at the union contract. and we were saying, hey, we need to make changes to the union contract. There's a lot of issues in here. And he's like, yeah. He was elected on a police reform platform, if you recall. He ran as a police reformist. Ted Wheeler ran as a police reformist 4 years ago. And we voted for him, not me, but we voted for him, many of us, based on that idea, right? Not me, no. But I sat in his office after that, and we talked about this. Me, Greg McKelvey, Alan Bell, a bunch of community advocates, a lot of Black people in the community sat down and talked to him and said, hey, man, at that time, they had a shortage of police. There were like 100 people understaffed. And we said, don't get more police. And he said, I can't do anything right now because I'm stuck under this union contract. It got signed before I was the mayor. It does. It gets signed in June, and the election's in November. So he wasn't lying. So I said, I'll see you in 4 years. So here we are in 4 years. And they signed the contract under the cover of darkness because of COVID, and they couldn't do Zoom meetings. They didn't know how, right? And here we are again. And the next mayor, if it's the same mayor as the next or a new mayor, is stuck under the same contract. So at what point do we go after this police union? And like, as Paige said, there's so many things in those. I have a copy of the contract on my phone. It's not hard to find. You can read it. The first page says that the city cannot legally argue with the union in court. The first page. So of course, Ted Wheeler can't say he's going to go against the union. He's legally bound not to. And that's in the contract that we can change. In fact, we can change it this year because they only assigned it for a 1 year right now. So focus on the union. It's not even really a labor union. It's not. I'm not even sure it's really legal. So it should be. I mean, there's a soldiers union for the state. It's not even labor. So it's being looked at. It's not just me talking at the top of my head, but it's real. Like, it's not even realistic stuff. So we need to really tear down these unions. We've seen what Daryl Turner is doing between being the president of the local union, as well as dealing with things on the state level, as well as this national union that's pushing out information about the Antifa starting forest fires. Like, they lie on camera. They have these press conferences. You've seen the NYPD's crazy press conferences. These are all and the union is just an organization of the cops. So they're all in on it. Attack the union, boot the union. It's got to happen.
Yeah, and there's just like some real things being said right now. I want to stay on the topic of unions, but we had a couple questions related that I wanted to say out loud and respond, and we can continue to answer. But so one question that we had from Kathleen is, as we divest from police and after minimal policing is established, how do you envision real accountability for police actions and crimes? And then we also had a question from Lena that asks, how do we help implement these changes that we're talking about? And actually tying both of those questions into the question around police unions, as folks probably know, there's actually going to be a measure on Oregon's ballot, or Portland's ballot, which would be a charter change, and it would establish a community oversight board for policing in Portland. As it is written, it would actually be one of the most comprehensive community oversight boards in the nation with real power, right? So some of us know that the reason why police at this point don't get in trouble is not only because of the police union, but it's also because of internal investigations, right? Like the process for internal investigations currently is not good because it's police investigating police. And so what if we flip the script a little bit and have community who, the police are supposed to be protecting, actually hold the police accountable. And so I just wanted to uplift that as like, maybe this is a way for us to actually engage on this issue, especially if you live in Portland or if you have friends in Portland. And I bring this up because guess what, everyone? The police union is probably going to spend $1 million to try to defeat this, right? Like, this is going to be a a turning point for police unions, and we know that the National Police Association already has eyes on this. And so I just wanted to open it up, and we can give it back to Mac. Mac, what are other ways that folks can get involved, and how do we really solidify this accountability?
Yeah, to kind of qualify this convo real quick in my perspective a little bit. Like I work for a big company, and we have old systems that we're replacing, like the tech systems that are being replaced. And as we're trying to upgrade and build this new replacement system that's going to be, decades newer than the old one, there are people, also consultants, coming in and trying to analyze the current processes, the current system, and making changes. And there's always this like battle between, like, for me, am I going to, spend my time? I'm paid pretty well. Am I going to spend my time analyzing the problems that we currently have, or working on the system that we want in the future, right? So for me, when we talk about things like police oversight, police reform, for me, that's not something I want, because I don't want police. So those are things that have to happen. People have to work in those steps, but I don't really spend a whole lot of my time in that world, because it's not the end that I want. And I feel like oftentimes our energy is stolen in politics by people giving us tasks to work on things that we don't actually want, to work on things that are better than what we currently have. So, like, as we talk about our police oversight system currently, it's like, I think this is like the third iteration of it. I think we actually have two, don't we? Have two right now, and neither of them work, right? So that's an issue for me. So when I hear people saying, hey, let's work on oversight, how are we going to make it work? The answer is kind of clear. It's like, just take the control away from the police, And I think this new one that's being worked on kind of does that. It gives the power, though, to the city council. So, if the people that decide the police are wrong do what they do, it pushes it to the city council. And, if the cops disagree, which I'm sure they always will. So it kind of becomes a matter of making the politicians vote on police practice, which I'm not sure is something that I really think is politically tenable. I think it's going to be, that would be actually pretty explosive, because then you have, Joanne and those guys like voting on whether to fire cops every few months, and that's going to be a lot. I'd watch it. So I mean, it's pretty interesting. I'm not sure that I'm totally tapped into everything that they should do to fix the police as they are, because I'm really just focused on trimming them down as much as humanly possible, as fast, as quickly as humanly possible.
Thank you. Yeah, and to also go off that, I know that Colorado passed a qualified immunity policy. Paige, if you want to talk a little bit about that, and then actually to wrap us up, because we're almost out of time, if you would also want to talk about how ACLU members can get involved. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the only thing I was really going to say about accountability, well, two things. One, abolish qualified immunity, just get rid of it across the board, just abolish it, get done. Really hoping that that's something that can be done across states in 2021. We saw it happen in Colorado. I think it can happen in other places. And in qualified immunity is basically the idea that officers can't be held civilly liable for engaging in misconduct for a range of it's really egregious. But the other thing I just wanted to mention briefly about accountability is, I think it really is important that we center accountability in communities, and communities tell us what they think accountability should look like, both when it comes to police misconduct, but also when it comes to like harm being committed, right? Like, as a survivor, I don't think accountability to me looks like going to the police. And I think it's really important for us to frame that, because I don't think accountability for a lot of people means putting someone in jail, getting someone locked up. And I think it's really important we reckon with that and think about the harms that our current criminal legal system perpetuates when somebody is inflicted with harm, and then the continuous harm in the system and the continuous trauma. When it comes to ACLU members, getting involved and supportive of this work, I think what's so exciting about kind of this new movement to defund, divest from police is that everything that's important that's going to happen around this is going to be on the local municipal level. And so you have so much power on your local level to get involved in this work. And the most meaningful, most impactful work is going to be happening on the ground, in base building, in organizing, grassroots movements, right? So the most impactful thing, I think, is getting involved in local organizations, reaching out to local organizers, and really building that power, building communities that can, hold our government officials accountable, and demand that they bring transformational change. So just all the most important work is going to happen on the local level. Get involved in your local community, get involved in local leadership, follow the leadership of Black organizers and Black leaders near you. I think that's the most important thing for people to do right now.
Awesome. And yeah, just to remind folks, one of the leading organizations on this is the Portland African American Leadership Forum. They've put together reports as well as a list of demands. And so that's personally who I followed. They are also run by Black femmes, and have such a good intersectional viewpoint of how they approach the work. So that would be my recommendation. Hey, Paige, Mac, thank you both so much for your expertise, for your work, for your sacrifice day in and day out. I personally appreciate it as a board member, and it's just been a pleasure to hang out with you all. And so I thank you again. And then, yeah, I'll just hand it back to Christina.
Thanks, Lamar. And again, thank you, Paige and Mac, for that incredibly engaging conversation. And it was really compelling, critical for our work for justice in Oregon and across the nation. And we're going to take one more short break before our final panel on immigrant justice. So we'll see you back here at 11:40. Thanks. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the ACLU of Oregon's membership conference, Justice for All. Our next and final panel is on organizing for immigrant justice, and we have 4 inspiring local leaders ready to share their insights and story. Facilitating this panel is Walidah Imarisha, Executive Director for the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, or EMERGE. EMERGE organizes diverse faith communities, faith leaders, and individuals called by conscience to respond actively and publicly to the suffering of our immigrant brothers and sisters in the U.S. due to unjust immigration policies. We welcome Walidah, Amber, Yanette, and Christina.
Thank you, Christina. I know I'm supposed to put my video on, but I can't without your permission, just FYI. Thank you. Oh, gotta love the Zoom and all its fun quirks. Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you to all the members of the ACLU of Oregon for being here with us today to be united with our immigrant communities. My name again is Walidah Imarisha, and I am the Executive Director of the Interfaith Movement for Immigrant Justice, or EMERGE for short. We're a statewide organization that accompanies and equips faithful people and faith communities for immigrant justice. Before we begin today, I want to take a moment to ground us in this space and to join together as we're coming back from break with one another. As we make the transition to being here in this panel, I wanted to open up the space in a way that grounds us in this moment with a poem by Sadie Whip. And this is an EMERGE practice to try to remain present and hear as we're listening to these stories, and also reflect and make meaning even in moments of pain. So I'll read the poem now, and you can feel free to close your eyes or do whatever you may need to do to be present. Do not forget that the ashes falling from the sky are all that remains of the pine and grass and thistle and bear and coyote and deer and mouse that could not escape. Scoop some up in a sacred manner. Take it to your altar. Offer prayers for these beings. Honor their death. Pray for life. Call in rain. Remind fire that it is full, has gobbled enough, and can rest. May all beings be safe. May all beings be loved. May all beings be remembered. May all beings be mourned. I want to acknowledge that many community members today, as we're present here, including immigrant community members, Black and Indigenous community members, have been displaced from their homes. I also want to acknowledge the farm workers that are working outside in these conditions to make sure that we're fed every day. At the end of this panel, we will be sharing some ways that you can donate and provide relief to immigrant communities displaced, especially since many immigrant community members are afraid to find help in other in other spaces. I want to highlight that while there's amazing leaders in this panel today that I will be introducing, there's also a lot of voices in the immigrant community members that are not here and present, and sometimes are intentionally invisibilized in this conversation. People that are detained today as we're facing this, people who may be marginalized, who may be farm workers. And as we begin the panel, I want you all to think of the immigrant community members that you're bringing today with you and are joining you in spirit as we're talking about organizing with immigrant communities. Organizing at the end of the day, I found, is about people and relationships and how those can transform systems in really significant ways. So it is important to name the people and relationships and think of them as essential to organizing. So this panel, Organizing for Immigrant Rights, it comes at a time when the abusive and secretive tactics of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security have emerged into the consciousness of America after protesters from racial justice were grabbed off the streets of Portland and swept away in unmarked vehicles. But we know that our immigrant communities have experienced these injustices since the inception of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. These abuses precede them and the Trump administration and will continue after the end of his destructive term, unless we rise up together against it and organize for a better future beyond Trump. Today, we're going to focus on each of us. Each of us can join the movement in our communities to protect the rights of immigrants and follow the lead of local organizers, those most affected. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you're about to see and the format today, and I promise I will not talk as much for the rest of this. We will start by introducing our panelists and learning more about the work that we're doing in their local communities and hear more about their context. This session is intended to be a conversation, and so I'll get us started by asking a question. Each person will introduce themselves, then I'll ask a question, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. If you have any questions from the panelists, you can feel free to put it in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. So you can type that while we are having conversation if a question comes up, and I'll get all of those questions and try to get through as many as I can. So our first panelist is Cristina Delgado, Leadership and Immigrant Solidarity Project Manager at Adelante Mujeres, a great partner who I love working with. Cristina is a proud first-generation immigrant. She grew up in Washington County and has lived in Oregon for more than 20 years. In 2016, she was awarded the Portland's monthly Light a Fire Award as an emerging leader for her work as family engagement coordinator, connecting and empowering Latina girls and their families. So that's, I'm really, really glad to be in a panel with her. Cristina and I work a lot together, and there's many a text thread happening between us. Cristina, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about who you are and the work that you do, and maybe I'll ask you a question just to get us like warmed up a little bit.
Yes, hola, buenos días. Hello, everyone. Good morning. And thank you, Walidah, for the introduction. Thank you, ACLU, for the invitation. It's really an honor to share this space with wonderful community organizers and people that are also committed and passionate about social justice issues. So it is a pleasure to be here today. Like Walidah mentioned, my name is Cristina Delgado. I work for Adelante Mujeres. And just to mention a little bit about the organization, Adelante Mujeres is a nonprofit organization located in the city of Forest Grove. We provide holistic education and empowerment opportunities to low-income Latina women and their families to ensure the full participation and active leadership in the community.
Thank you so much, Cristina. And I'm wondering, I mean, I know that I keep mentioning it, but it is true. You and I are in touch a lot as things are happening in Washington County. And I know that Adelante Mujeres is part of coalitions and has been kind of central to organizing its relationship building and doing the work together, right? With lawyers, with, with community members, with all kinds of people. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what the work looks like and is of Adelante Mujeres in partnerships and in relationship with others.
Yes, so everything that we do through Adelante and the Immigrant Solidarity Project is through partnerships and collaborating with local organizations, groups of people who are trying to organize and who are doing a great work, doing a lot of this organizing work in the county, as well as statewide coalitions and collaboratives. So we don't do anything without partnerships, and we really value collaborating with so many different organizations. And then of course, always keeping in mind and encouraging impacted community members to be a part of the planning and everything that we do. But I can share a little bit more about the collaborative effort that we have going on in Washington County when it comes to immigrant justice. This is the Immigrant Solidarity Project. So it is a project that is supported by Adelante Mujeres and 7 other organizations in Washington County. Some of the agencies that are a part of this project or collaborative include Bienestar, Centro Cultural, Community Action, Dreamers Resource Center, Defensa de la Dignidad, Virginia Garcia, and SOAR. And a little bit more about this project and what we do, just to give you some background. It began in 2017 with the hopes to respond to the fear, trauma, anxiety, uncertainty that people were experiencing after the 2016 election. And the hope was really to respond to the needs and priorities of immigrant community members in the county, specifically in Washington County. And how do we respond? We do that through promotores. Promotores are community members who are directly impacted. Many of them are first-generation immigrants with mixed status families and who are directly impacted by immigration policies. So that's our base. That's particularly the community that we serve and that guide us in the process of what we are having to work on or mobilize on. But just to mention a little bit about it, the campaigns or some of the efforts that we have been working on, and I can mention a few of them. But first, I also wanted to mention that everything that we do is by listening to the community, to listen to promotores, who is our base, listening to families that are directly impacted about their priorities and needs. So that really helps us guide our work. And for example, in the last 2 years, the project has been joining efforts with a lot of local organizations and statewide coalitions to respond to some of the needs in the community. And these are some of the top needs that people identified. And one of them being the need for driver's licenses. And we kept hearing that from a lot of community members, not only at the county level, but also at the state level, how not having driver's licenses was deeply impacting community members and the entire family. And so we started organizing here in Washington County, again, with the partnership of and the lead of CAUSA and the statewide coalitions to make sure that community members knew about this campaign so that they could also be engaged in these efforts. We started doing forums and train the trainers. Some of our promotores, the participants of the program, started participating in panels where they were sharing information about how they were being directly impacted. And then we started doing or attending advocacy days, doing phone banking, petitions, and so on. So that is one of the campaigns that here in Washington County, we really focused because, again, it was something that we were hearing from community members. It was the #1 priority that people had. And then, of course, we know the results. We were very successful in that campaign, and we are just really looking forward to families now being able to access driver's licenses, hopefully next year. And then another initiative, another big issue that we have been working on is protecting Oregon sanctuary law, which also comes down to what we're hearing from community members. We kept hearing that people were fearful of being detained by ICE at their homes, at their workplace, in public spaces, and also outside of the courthouses. And we really decided that, yes, that's something that we're hearing from community members often, and that it should be a priority. And so again, we joined efforts with a lot of great organizations, Emerge, ACLU, and many other organizations that were a part of defeating Measure 105, getting ICE out of Oregon courthouses, and engaging in conversations with our local officials, really to ensure that there was no collaboration between ICE and law enforcement. So just a couple of examples in terms of what we are doing and how we're responding. But I would say that most or the major part of what we do is educational campaign. We really want to make sure that community members are informed about the recent immigration updates and working on some other priorities that included DACA and public charge, and making sure that community members are receiving this important training where they can learn about advocacy, organizing, immigration updates, resources, know your rights, and many other topics. And so, again, for that reason, we focus a lot of our efforts in education, because we are certain that through education, we can live in a community where all immigrant families feel safe, have knowledge about their rights, support one another with resources, and are ready to respond and advocate when needed.
That's amazing, Cristina. Thank you for the work. And I think that some of the, I know that things have been, I would say, pretty grim immigration-wise at the federal level. I don't know, that's probably putting it lightly. But in Oregon, we have had so many things happen too as a result of people really bringing some political education and understanding about how states can step in to protect and to acknowledge that immigrant community members have been here for a long time and deserve rights. and deserve things like driver's licenses, right? Deserve things like not being scared of taking their child to school because ICE is gonna detain them, right? Like these are things that immigrant community members have deserved all along. And finally, it feels like some of the states are catching on to that. And so it's so beautiful to hear the way that partnerships together, all of us are pushing for some of these things and have been able to have some important, significant wins and show up at the state level. I want to ask a little bit more and maybe bring in another of our panelists. Janet Sarai Gerandi Gonzalez is the director at Mecca Bend. And Janet has lived in Bend for 9 years and founded Mecca Bend to be a means for supporting and uplifting the Latinx community in Central Oregon. Most recently, Janet was among the first on the ground and leading the response to the ICE raids in Bend on August 12th, if you all heard about it. Her organizing led to a massive public support and national coverage of what was happening. And so Janet, welcome, good morning. Also have been in many a Zoom call with you, not with this many people watching us, but it's a little bit different. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about who you are, what you do, and maybe I'll ask you a quick follow-up question.
Yes, thank you, Walidah, for having us. ACLU, thank you so much. Our support and our love and our hearts goes out to all of the Oregonians right now affected by the fires. So I just wanted to state that. So thank you for taking some time out of everybody's day to join us. I'm Janet Yerandi Gonzalez. My organization, Mecca Bend, was founded about 2 years ago. And it really was in response to a lack of opportunity for Latinx leaders to be uplifted in Central Oregon. We are really in a rural area of Oregon, and a lot of the opportunities that are in the bigger cities sometimes don't come out here. And so Mecca Bend was formed with that purpose, is to uplift, to advocate, and to provide resources for the Latinx community that resides in Central Oregon, and doing that with dignity and with the respect that we deserve as members of this community.
Thank you so much for that. It's so lovely. And it's been an honor to see the work that you all have done from here and to accompany you all in the capacity we can. I'm curious about, I think that both Christina and I are generally, in like the really broad Portland metro area. And so I'm based in Portland, Christina's in Washington County. I'm really curious about your experience around organizing in a more rural community, we should say, what that is like, if you have a sense of how it's similar or different from some of the organizing that might happen, how it changes your dynamics and the strategies that you have in your community.
Sure. So I was actually a Portland resident for many years. My family moved from Inglewood, California to Portland back in the early 90s. And so I grew up in that area, and seeing some of the larger organizations and larger agencies that exist for the marginalized communities really put me in the light and in the perspective of wanting to do something similar, although not to that scale, but with the same intention as those organizations and agencies out here when I moved to Central Oregon about 9 years ago. One of the challenges, again, that we face out here is that the opportunities don't arise for us as much as they do in the bigger cities. And because the Latino population is so much smaller here, although it is a large percentage in comparison to the dominant cultures, there is sort of a lack of funds and of resources and opportunities for the Latinos out here, because there isn't such a large concentration as there is in areas like Portland, Hillsborough, and all of the other areas in Oregon. So it poses a challenge, but at the same time, it creates a really incredible opportunity for us Latinos out here to self-advocate and to put ourselves in positions where we're probably not invited, but we bring our seats anyways. and that sort of is the aim and the goal of what I want to do with Mecca out here, is that we need to create a space for our community to gather together and to uplift one another. This isn't a role of leadership where one person singularly speaks for the whole of the community. It's bringing in the voices that are already here. the wisdom, the knowledge, the lived experience that's already within the Latinx leaders that are here, and creating sort of this window, or opening that window for us to show up in those spaces where we're traditionally not invited. And historically too, we know that it was an incredibly powerful summary of the history of racism against the Black community in Oregon. Similarly, we have something with the Latinx community in Oregon, and particularly with the migrant field workers here. When I lived in Portland, Oregon, I worked the fields with my mother in Sandy, Oregon. We picked berries for pennies for buckets. So it's something that is not only close to me personally, but it's something that's really close to most of us that are in the Latino community, whether we're in the rural areas or we're in the bigger cities. We have those bonds, we have those ties that connect us. And so to create something out here, a movement out here that uplifts those voices and says, we're not all uneducated, we're not all migrant field workers, although we have that in our background, we're here to show you that we can lead our own community.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the issues that you bring around resources and connections, I think it's even a challenge among our own, organizations and leaders that sometimes bend and the work can feel far away. And then, but in reality, when you see, ICE that's abducting people here in Portland show up Border Patrol show up in Bend, you realize like the systems are connected. So how do we connect to each other as people pushing back against those things? It's like, it's really interesting to hear you talk about that. And I'm really thankful that you're there in that position and you're organizing the communities and bringing some of our awesome wisdom that already exists to do that, to ground that. And we'll talk, I think, more about some of that, like what that all means. I think we'll parse it out in a bit. But before we get there, I wanted to bring in our third panelist, Amber Rose Orion. She's the lead community organizer and co-founder of the Gorge Ice Resistance. Amber is a rural community organizer and has been a foundational member of the team that recently won a major victory in getting ICE out of Norcor, the only jail in Oregon that holds federal immigration detainees. Another awesome thing that happened just in the last 2 weeks in the midst of so much, 2 weeks? No, maybe more. Okay, you can tell us the actual timeline. What am I talking about? And Amber has lived in the Columbia River Gorge for 20 years and currently serves on the Hood River Latino Network Board and manages the Gorge-wide Rapid Response Team. So Amber, I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself a little bit and you can tell us a little bit about your work.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elede. Hello to all. I want to first thank the ACLU for inviting me to be here today to share our group's experience. This has been a really powerful conference, and listening to all of the grassroots organizers, the speakers, just listening to all the incredible work being done on the ground, I am humbled and grateful and truly, truly inspired by the work that's being done, and really just the passion behind it. As Elede mentioned, my name is Amber and I am an organizer with Gorge Ice Resistance. We also affectionately call it GIR. We are a coalition in the Gorge and throughout the state of immigrants and allies who are working to hold our local jail, Norcor, accountable and get them to end the contract with ICE that they have. So Norcor is a regional jail funded primarily by the 4 counties that it incarcerates: Wasco County, Hood River County, Sherman, and Gillum. And just a little bit of background, in early 2017, local community members became aware that our local jail was holding people for the government in immigration detention and without any oversight. And so we started showing up and we started pushing. And after months of board meetings and community pressure, we also received calls from Rural Organizing Project, Emerge, and Maru Mora with La Resistencia in Tacoma, seeking local support on behalf of immigrants that were detained up at Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. And at that time, about half of the population at that center, at that facility, had gone on a hunger strike. So people were desperate. Their voices had been removed. They were not being taken care of. The abuses were massive. And so they decided to use their bodies as the only tool that they had left to say, no, we refuse, something needs to change and somebody needs to pay attention. And In retaliation, the reason that we had become involved here, since we are not in Tacoma, is because GEO Group, who owns Northwest Detention Center, they're one of the largest private prison corporations in the United States, and ICE had separated the leaders from the movement and transferred them to Norcor in retaliation to try to end the strike. So that is how Gorge ICE Resistance was born.
Yeah, that's that's a lot, and I know that we're part of some of those efforts at the beginning, but I'm really wondering, I know that you all at the local level have really held so much of that work and what's happened since then. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the recent victory. I think you began to say a little bit about like all the background, but the recent victory in Norcor, what that means, what it got, what it meant, or like how you got there, just whatever you want to share about ending the contract, Norcor ending the contract with ICE, which is a huge deal because ICE, I mean, Norcor is the only really like place where immigrants are detained in Oregon, right? In the state of Oregon.
Yes.
So that's a huge deal. It means that like when you heard close the camp, this is like the camp. So I want to hear more about the story from your perspective and from the local perspective about how this all happened.
Absolutely. Thank you. So with that little bit of history that I shared with you, our group came up with some very specific goals. And I think that's a little bit different in our organizing process. Because although we are here to serve our immigrant communities and continue to show up, we have very specific goals that we've been working on. And the number one was get ICE out of Norcor, like you just said. We also wanted to make sure that we were supporting and elevating the message of those detained while they were detained, continuing to help spread that message because they didn't have that access. We wanted to hold Norcor accountable, and we also wanted to remove the jail administrator from his position. And we did that. That was one of the wins in the beginning, along with other things. We fought really hard to elevate those voices so that while we continued to work towards this thing that has just recently happened in ending ICE contract, we tried to make conditions as humane as possible in the meantime. And we took that from the people who were inside. We listened, we had attorneys and clergy who met with people inside regularly and continued to collect information. And it was super, super important because none of the work that we could do out here was going to really be effective or important if we aren't listening to the voices of those who are directly affected. So we continued to show up and get information and distribute that among our communities so that they understood what was happening and share stories, always with consent, of people who had journeys and were going through this. So I could give you a whole list of all of the things that we've done over time, but realistically, what we did was what everybody else here is talking about, which is so important, and that is coming together as community members, listening to those who are most affected, and building upon that. And the only way we did that was continuing to build with community members and other organizations. So I know I'll miss some, but with organizations like y'all, with Emerge, ACLU, Rural Organizing Project, Somos Uno, otherwise known as Gorge Ecumenical Ministries, American Friends Service Committee, Immigration Counseling Services, Hooterville Latino Network, Columbia Gorge Women's Action Network. There were so many people, and I'm positive I have not listed everybody that has been fully involved. And we worked really hard on social media and in person. We have supported lawsuits, efforts to replace elected officials, anything that stood in the way of getting rid of this contract or stood in the way of our immigrant community members being able to live a full and safe existence in our communities, we worked for and we supported. I also have worked with Christina before, and I really enjoy working with her. I'm just so excited because the more that we build over the years, it feels like it gets a little more exciting. Those connections and those bonds, those things that we build. So all that to say, going through all of these pieces, we did have one large march in the middle of all of this with Emerge and RLP, where we marched from Sheridan to Norcor for an entire week with multiple people, and we brought a lot of attention to Measure 105. We brought a lot of attention to what was going on at Sheridan, at Norcor, and like you said, Elede, with the camps that we have open currently in this state. Through all of this work, on August 20th, in the middle of preparing for this panel. So it was a little unexpected when we first started planning. It was, hey, let's talk about what's been going on and what we're trying to do. And now it's, oh my goodness, the ICE contract has been canceled. So August 20th, the board voted unanimously to terminate the contract with ICE. There are a few pieces to that I want to throw out there, and that is we are still in the phase of where they're getting rid of the contract. There are two contracts, one with adults, one with juveniles. The contracts will be terminated in 30 and 60 days respectively. And what we're doing now is we're watching. We're showing up, we're asking questions, we're making sure that what is being told to us will be followed through on. And not only that, but we have a few questions about a few new line items that don't quite make sense. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And I bring that up specifically because y'all who are here attending today, if you have the opportunity and feel so inclined, we would love for you to sign a petition that we have that is asking Norcor to put in writing that not only are they ending these contracts, but that they will no longer work with ICE on any level or ever hold another contract with immigration and customs officials or any other type of agency in the future, period. So that link, I think we can share in the chat box. Okay. And then we can get everybody to sign on that and hopefully hold them accountable as we move forward.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Amber. I think that this, I don't know, tension between I think we, in some of our work organizing around policing and centering Black lives in some of that work at Emerge that we've taken on with immigrant communities, we've so lived in that tension of like improving conditions and at the same time working to end or dismantle this crappy system. I would use harsher language if we weren't in an ACLU panel, right? And so like that tension between like doing, you know, I think that some of the community members that are detained today want conditions improved and changed, but at the same time, never leaving the idea that those detention centers shouldn't exist in the first place. And similarly, I think as I hear the ending of the ICE contract, which is something that I know you all and we've all been working hard on, similarly thinking about the lives and the communities and the people that are still there and are still targeted by police, specifically Black community members who are still targeted and put in Norcor, even if immigrant community members aren't. And I think it's just like an important name of like how much of our work in organizing is like holding these tensions and trying to navigate them both like in our own bodies and out there in the work that we do as organizers and as like and seeing like a systems that they just don't work and they need to be dismantled. So I just so appreciate you naming some of that, and I just wanted to highlight it because it's so I don't know, I think like when you're looking back to some degree in some of the work that you've done, it's like easy to see, I don't know, you're naming it so beautifully. I wanted to go back to something that I think we all mentioned, and maybe Janet, you can begin answering this question, but Christina and Amber, you both touched on it around centering immigrant community members in the work, like what that looks like, what that feels like, what it is like. I heard us all name and Emerge similarly, naming what does it look like to organize when you're centering the lives of immigrant communities, when you do immigrant organizing. In the work. And so I'm just really curious about what that means practically, what that feels like. And I'll have a follow-up question about, I think that a lot of the folks that are listening to us are allies. And so how do allies show up to do that work too? And how is it helpful or not helpful? But maybe just hearing a little bit more, Janet, about what does it look like for you to then center the lives? And you touched on it a little bit more, but I wanna know more.
Yeah, so I'll relay this sort of shortened version of what happened during COVID. Amongst the severity of the pandemic and everything that we were seeing with the disproportionate outcomes of how the Latino and undocumented immigrant community was being affected by the pandemic, not only with their health, but also with their emotional well-being, with their mental well-being, with their financial well-being, and the instability that COVID created around all of us. We know that the impact was even heavier and more severe to that community. One of the challenges that I posed to my local community, to our allies in White Utopia Bend, was that I was still a salaried employee through another organization. I did not lose my job. My wages were not affected by COVID. Yet so many of my friends and community members had suffered job losses and drastic wage reductions. The challenge that I posed to the community was, if I'm still earning my paycheck, what do I need the stimulus check for? Sure, I'm a single parent. I could apply it to many things that are on the top of my list, but I know that the need is greater elsewhere than in my own household. So I challenged them to donate their stimulus check or a portion of it to go specifically to the undocumented members of our community who did not have access to the Federal CARES Act funding, who did not qualify for unemployment insurance through the state of Oregon due to them not having that Social Security number, although they were working under what's known as an ITIN, or an individual taxpayer identification number. They contributed thousands upon thousands of dollars throughout their history of working in our community to our state and local taxes, as well as to our federal government. And so for them to have all of these issues coming on them during COVID, and then not being able to access the same things that you and I could access, is a huge inequity. And the majority of the allies in our community weren't even aware of it. And so bringing forth these issues, bringing forth this information to them, really created an opportunity for the ally community to step up. We were able to raise, and we're still raising funds, but we were able to raise initially over $80,000 to distribute to our community. And it came in the form of cash assistance, which is unheard of. And maybe the IRS will bark at me later for it. That's okay. That's okay. But again, with dignity and with respect, because a lot of the organizations that offer assistance to the undocumented community do it through a way that is still inaccessible to them. And so the goal of Mecca Bend was to do it with that dignity and with that respect. And so, and that is what we did during COVID, and we continue to do. So that's just one way. And really, I think a lot of us shy away from talking about dollars, but the biggest way that anybody can contribute and can help is by donating their dollars, is by sharing their resources, by sharing their wealth, and making some of these inequities a little more just.
Yeah, thank you, Janet. Yeah, resources, it's a huge issue. I find that oftentimes community organizing organizations are not the first ones. I think some amazing work is being done by lawyers like the ACLU, right? Like there's really amazing work, but as we talked about, I think it takes all of these different pieces to actually change systems, and it takes community transformation. And I see oftentimes, I think it's beautiful, and also I notice it, like both of those things are true, that whenever something happens in the immigrant community, there's this specific places where people give, and community organizing sometimes doesn't come to the mind of folks, right? Even though you are in contact with and organizing and talking to the specific community members that are being affected by COVID, for example, or who are being detained by ICE, but that is seen as, because maybe people don't see it as immediate help. I don't really know what it is, that sometimes that lens tends to be forgotten, even though it's so central to some of the wins that we're talking about, like so central to North Shore, so central to what happened in Bend and COVID relief, so central to Washington County and making sure that Washington County is a welcoming community, or a community that wants justice, right? So it's like, I'm so glad that you bring up resources, because that's an important highlight part of like it all. And lucky for everyone, we have ways that you can donate to all of our organizations if you want to at the end of this. So Christina, I'm curious about just asking some of this. So basically taking from what Janet, talked about a little bit and adding, I'm wondering about how you've seen allies or people who are not impacted community members show up in helpful ways. And maybe if you're feeling up to it, also answering, how do people show up in not helpful ways? What is not helpful for allies to do as we are dealing with so many different crises at many levels? So, Christina.
Thank you, Elaide. I have seen how allies have been very supportive when it comes to showing up at particular places where perhaps impacted community members might not feel so comfortable showing up. Like per se rallies. Another example could be when we do petitions, when we're organizing and we're asking people to advocate and to take action. A lot of times what I get asked by community members is my information safe if I sign this petition? Is my information safe if I make the call to my legislator? So not for everyone, I don't want to generalize. I know that for some community members, it might feel uncomfortable to do that sort of advocacy. And I have seen how the support of allies is very important and very strong in that sense, to show up at those advocacy events when it comes to rallies, when it comes to advocating and connecting with legislators, signing petitions, and all of that. Another way is the rapid response teams. I know that in a couple of different cities across the state, there are groups that are ready to respond and that are ready to record any ICE activity. That is also very helpful. I know that there are wonderful legal observers who are allies, and that's just wonderful work that I feel it's very important, and I just really value that. One of the things that I would mention in terms of what I value in terms of allies as well is to really listen to the priorities of the community when it comes to organizing. And I know we have been talking about this, listening to what do people need and what are the priorities that people are mentioning over and over again. And maybe to be open to learning about the different efforts that are already being done by impacted community members in the area or in a particular issue, because there might be groups that have already been formed and that are doing this great work that we can just partner with. And the other piece to it would be like if you have the privilege to be in a space where you get to make decisions and be in decision-making tables, to also advocate so that more community members of color and especially immigrants who are directly impacted by immigration issues can also be at the table and provide their thoughts and opinions about important issues as well.
Thank you, Christina. I have show up, join rapid response to the degree that you can, listen to the priorities of the community and be open. If you're in positions of power, make sure that you're advocating for immigrant community members and I would say add a seat at the table for them so that they advocate for themselves. Amber and Janet, anything else that is helpful? Or maybe one of you wants to be brave and take the non-helpful. I can also take the non-helpful. I have some thoughts about that. But if you want to add anything, I just want to open up some of that space.
Well, I'll state something, and with all respect, I'll say this as gently as I can. What's not helpful is speaking for us. What's not helpful is the white savior mentality that's been happening for too long in this country. Again, we are a community that is strong. We are knowledgeable. We have the wisdom. We have the lived experience. We know what we need. We know what works, and we know what doesn't work. And so oftentimes that's ceding your platform to communities of color, particularly to the undocumented immigrants. And that sometimes means giving up a seat at the table.
Yes, thanks for that. I can not emphasize that enough. For sure, oftentimes people will come to emerge asking like, what is the one thing that will solve all immigration injustice issues? And that is so far from, from where we are around immigrant justice. It's just not, it's a complicated system and there's not one thing. And so really taking in the stories of people affected and being able to channel that into action and showing up in the ways that Christina, you highlighted, despite maybe not knowing all, and being humble and knowing that if you're asking what is the one thing, then you probably don't have a sense of the full system, and that's okay. Not all of us have to. We hold some of that knowledge for folks to learn it in small bits, right? Being humble in coming into those spaces, even if you have had a lot of power, even if you're an expert in something that isn't related to immigration. It's such like a central part of the things that I appreciate when people are coming in with communities. And organizations like Emerge, for example, we do that work. We're like, come in, if you've done this for 2 days and you saw a news story, you're welcome in our space. And we're going to expect you to do some learning along the way and some like really internal work, but like both of those things are really important. We have a question. So I've moved on. Some of these questions are from the audience, and I know that we probably won't get to them all, but I promise we will try to address them. I don't know, we'll talk to the ACLU, but we have a specific question about Norcore, Amber, that I'm wondering if you may be willing to explain a little bit more about. So I think there was some confusion. Somebody, Marilyn, asks about who is in prison at Norcore, and why is it bad for ICE to be there? Like, who runs it? Just like give us a little bit more of a sense of what Norcore is, and then why is it significant that it got rid of the ICE contract, or it voted to stop the ICE contract?
Absolutely. Let's see, you asked 2 questions there, and I want to make sure I cover them both. A little bit more about Norcore. So Norcore, I had mentioned, is a 4-county regional correctional facility. So it is a little bit different than a typical like sheriff's office in the way that it's built. So it's held accountable by the 4 counties that it incarcerates. It's also funded by them, and it's run by county commissioners from each county and sheriffs from each county. So it's this collaborative effort that they do. And Norcore has had a contract with ICE previously that was actually wiped out when Northwest Detention Center was built back in 2007. And so it's only been about 5 years that they've had this contract again, and that's why we're fighting against this. And the reason that it is, well, there are a number of reasons. One, we want ICE out of our communities. And we also recognize in all of this, and I think it's important even with this victory to note that this is one step, that kind of like getting rid of Trump, that is really important. It's not the final step. It's not the thing that's going to solve all of the problems, but it is going to remove a barrier and make way for real progress. And this, getting ICE out of Norcore, is just like that. It's one of those steps. I don't want to compare it to getting rid of Trump, but it's a step like that. And so as we say, Norcore, first of all, is also set up to be a local, small town, short-term facility for people to be at and then be transferred out or let out or whatnot. It is not set up for long-term. It is not set up for this type of thing. And realistically, our overall goal is to get ICE out of everywhere. So we want ICE out of Norcore because we want ICE out of the Gorge, because we want ICE out of Oregon, because we want ICE out of this country. We want them completely abolished. And it's really important that every single step. Not to mention the other piece that's huge is people who live here, our immigrant communities, people who are at risk, people who are targeted and harassed. It changes the dynamics knowing who our county facilities are working with, and just the actual physical presence of ICE agents within the Gorge and that cooperation. We want that to end. We want Norcore to stop. We don't want just the people gone. We want the cooperation to stop.
Yes, thank you for that. That's so amazingly put. I'm looking at the time and we're almost running out of time. I know you all have more questions, but before we leave, I want to just open up the space for each of you, and maybe we'll start with you, Cristina. I'm wondering, what is the next step for ACLU members who want to continue their support for immigrant rights in Oregon? What do you suggest? How can they connect? We don't have a ton of time, so maybe like a minute question, some rapid fire questioning here. Cristina, you can start us, and then maybe Janet and Amber after that.
Yes, thank you, Walidah. And there are a couple of great campaigns taking place nationwide. Free Them All campaign. There's a lot of movement also with TPS, temporary protection status, and a couple of people coming to Oregon and raising more awareness on that. But through the Oregon Ready Education Committee, we are creating curriculum so that we can have a Know Your Rights, Train the Trainer packet that might be available hopefully before the end of the year, if not next year. And that might be another great opportunity for community members to continue to have the knowledge and then share it out with community members, with employers, and everybody that we know of. We're also developing other education material that could be helpful to share out with families and community members in the area. But yeah, more than anything, initiative, I think this is the time where everything or anything that we do is important, and it starts with an idea. It starts with taking action. It starts with mobilizing our immediate community members and start, making change. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Janet?
One of the things we hear frequently, just as we heard about defunding the police and abolishing those systems, our goal also is the same for the Latinx community, abolishing ICE and abolishing the systems of white supremacy that uphold the oppression that our immigrant communities and our Latinx communities suffer through. One of the first steps to achieving that is for the dominant culture and for white folks that are here to recognize the privilege that they hold in these systems and to recognize their positions of power. And once the recognition is there, once we come to terms or come to grips with that reality, I think it would be a lot easier for the ally community to be able to cede the power and to, again, empty the seats, let other people lead, let communities of color lead their own communities, and keep showing up in ways that are actual action items that are tangible, that whether it means sharing your resources and, contributing to the financial advancement of grassroots organizations, but also being active in it and not settling for just once or twice. This is an ongoing process, and we need the allies in our community, and we need them to step up in very specific ways.
Thank you. Amber, do you have, what would you add?
I think that both Cristina and Janet really covered a lot. The only other thing I was going to throw out there is Measure 110 in Oregon, which is decriminalizing of drugs, which we know affects communities of color and immigrant communities exponentially higher rates. So jump on that, learn more about that. If you have the access and can register and vote, please do so in all elections, particularly local and state elections. And I want to just say something real quick to the allies in our crowd right now, and that is, I really, really want to 100% what I just heard from Cristina and Janet, and that is meet people where they're at. Listen to what the people that you are working to elevate their voices and to work with, listen to them. Do not assign needs to them. Listen to what they tell you they need, because when we assign needs to people, we are missing the point, and that goes into the white savior complex, I believe, that was spoken about earlier. So listen to the voices and the experience of immigrants, and more importantly, believe them. Believe those experiences and continue to show up, learn, change, be accountable, be teachable, get out of your comfort zone, use your voice, use your privilege, and speak up for all of the voices who have been silenced.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I will add that at Emerge, our organization, we are having something called Sacred Circles, which is an organizing, a way for people to come together at least once a month to do some work around both policing and also immigrant justice and racial justice. So we have a training coming up. There's going to be a link share. If you want to look at that training and see if this may be something for you, you have to put together a group of communities. If you want to find a way to start, you can totally do that. We would love for you to do that. Also, as we are closing up the time, thank you, Cristina. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, ACLU. I'm going to read one more time the poem that I began, since people seem to really like it, and to close us off. And as I do that, I want to just ask and I think they have shared, some of the ACLU folks, to just share our posts around some of the needs that immigrant communities are having that have been displaced by the fires, and some of the ways to donate and show up. There's going to be more things. Please follow all of our social media as we can share as we're hearing more about what the needs are. But it's really important, and some of our immigrant community members are afraid to go to some of the usual places for help. And so we need to ground ourselves in the communities that they already trust. And so we're trying to do some of those connections. So please, we are sharing that. And as I'm reading it, I just want to make sure that you have those resources, both cash and physical. If you're in Portland, physical and donations are appreciated. We're working with immigrant rights organizations to get that to the right places. So as we close off, one poem I'm going to start reading. And again, close your eyes, center yourself. Do not forget that the ashes falling from the sky are all that remains of the pine and grass and thistle and bear and coyote and deer and mouse that could not escape. Scoop some up in a sacred manner. Take it to your altar. Offer prayers for these beings. Honor their death. Pray for life. Call in rain. Remind fire that it is full, has gobbled up enough and can rest. May all beings be safe. May all beings be loved. May all beings be remembered. May all beings be mourned. Thank you all. Thanks for joining. Thank you. Love you all.
Thank you, Walidah, Christina, Yanette, and Amber. What a powerful and important panel. We're so appreciative to be working in partnership with you all. And thanks again to all of our other guests today, Amber Hikes, Walidah Imarisha, Lamar Wise, Paige Fernandez, and Max Smith. Thanks to Summer and Angela for interpreting, and thanks to Carol and Deanna for captioning this event. And a special thanks to all the folks behind the scenes who made this conference possible, and especially to my ACLU of Oregon family and staff. There was a lot of great information and resources to absorb and reflect on as we continue to do this work. So a recording of this conference will be made available on our website early next week. And before you go, please remember that a survey will open up automatically. We want to know how we did, what we can do better next time, and what you want to know more about. Additionally, we ask you to take a moment to support the organization and work and leadership of many people featured in today's conference. All this critical work happens because of our members. To become or renew your Oregon ACLU membership, visit our website. Thanks again for tuning into our second membership conference. I hope you'll join us again for upcoming events, including our webinar on October 22nd to talk about the 2020 election, on November 12th for a post-election State of the Union update, and on March 12th at our virtual Liberty Dinner, featuring keynote speaker Nicole Hannah-Jones, creator of the 1619 Project. Registration and more information is available on our website. Thanks for joining us today. We remain committed to offering a way to prepare all of us to do work collaboratively towards building a future for Oregon in which there is justice for all. Please stay safe and be well.